My parents called me a thief to every corporate employer in Chicago. For 2 years, my resume was toxic and no one would hire me. Last week, I sat in what I thought was just another dead-end interview, ready for another rejection. Then the CEO pulled out a sealed letter my grandmother wrote 10 years ago, and the entire room went completely silent. My name is Rachel. I am 33 years old, and until that moment, I thought my life was completely over. If you have ever been pushed to the absolute edge by the people who were supposed to protect you, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe to hear how I turned a 10-year-old letter into the ultimate corporate takedown. The winter wind in Chicago was brutal the morning I walked into the Pierce Global building. My hands were freezing, but my palms were sweating inside my cheap wool coat. Pierce Global was a titan in the logistics industry. Their headquarters was a towering fortress of glass and steel that dominated the downtown skyline. I stood in the massive marble lobby feeling entirely out of place. 2 years ago, I would have walked into this building with total confidence. Back then, I was a top-tier supply chain analyst and a ruthless internal auditor. I knew my worth, and I knew my industry. But 2 years of relentless rejection can break even the strongest person. I had been ghosted by dozens of recruiters. I had received countless automated rejection emails. I was down to the last few $1,000s in my savings account fighting off eviction notices and eating cheap canned food just to survive. I had applied for a mid-level analyst position at Pierce Global, expecting to be interviewed by some junior HR representative. Instead, the receptionist directed me to the top floor, the executive suite. I had no idea why Jonathan Pierce, the billionaire CEO of the entire corporation, was taking the time to interview a desperate candidate for a mid-level job. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, a silent assistant led me down a long hallway lined with expensive modern art. She opened the heavy oak doors to the boardroom and gestured for me to step inside. The room was intimidating. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying view of Lake Michigan. Sitting at the far end of a massive glass conference table was Jonathan Pierce. He was 55 years old with sharp features, silver hair, and eyes that looked like they could cut through solid steel. He did not smile when I walked in. He did not offer small talk or ask about my journey to the office. "Sit down, Rachel," he said, pointing to the leather chair across from him. His voice was deep and commanding. I took my seat, keeping my posture perfectly straight. I had rehearsed my answers to all the standard interview questions. I was ready to talk about supply chain optimization, vendor management, and financial forecasting. I was ready to prove that I was still the brilliant analyst I used to be. But Jonathan did not open my resume. He did not ask about my skills or my education. Instead, he reached into a sleek leather folder and pulled out a single printed email. He slid it across the smooth glass table until it stopped right in front of me. "Read it," he commanded. I looked down at the paper. My heart stopped beating, and the blood drained completely from my face. The email was sent from the official corporate address of Apex Distribution, the medical supply company founded by my late grandmother Beatrice and currently run by my parents William and Catherine. I recognized the signature block at the bottom immediately. It was my mother. I read the words printed on the page and felt a familiar, suffocating wave of panic and humiliation wash over me. "To whom it may concern," the email began. "We understand Rachel has applied for a position at your firm. It is our unfortunate duty as industry peers to inform you that our daughter Rachel was terminated from Apex Distribution for embezzling $250,000. We chose not to press criminal charges out of familial obligation, but she is a thief. Do not hire her." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. I stared at the piece of paper, feeling the air leave my lungs. This was the ghost that had been haunting me for 2 years. This was the reason my career had vanished overnight. My own parents had not just fired me, they had actively hunted down every application I submitted and poisoned the well. They had blacklisted me across the entire city of Chicago. I expected Jonathan to stand up and ask security to escort me out of the building. That is what happened at the last firm I interviewed with. But Jonathan just sat there, resting his chin on his steepled fingers, watching me with an unreadable expression. Why would a top-tier auditor let her own parents ruin her career without putting up a fight? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Why did you just roll over and let them brand you as a criminal? I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, forcing myself to breathe. I refused to cry. I had shed all my tears 2 years ago when I realized my family viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle to their greed. I opened my eyes and looked Jonathan Pierce dead in the face. My jaw tightened, and the fear I had been carrying into this room suddenly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, hard rage. Because they owned the servers, Mr. Pierce, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I was the lead internal auditor for Apex Distribution. 2 years ago, I was running a routine quarterly reconciliation when I found massive discrepancies in the vendor payout logs. I dug deeper and ran a full forensic audit on my own time. What I found was a sophisticated network of shell companies and phantom vendors. Apex was bleeding cash, but it was not due to market conditions. Jonathan raised a single eyebrow, waiting for me to continue. My parents were cooking the books, I explained, leaning forward. William and Catherine were siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the company operating budget. They were using it to fund an incredibly lavish lifestyle for my younger sister, Madison. Madison is 29 years old and has never worked a real day in her life, but my parents appointed her as the chief financial officer of Apex, just to give her a massive salary and full access to the corporate credit lines. They were draining the employee pension funds to pay for Madison, to buy luxury cars and take month-long vacations to Europe. I took a deep breath, remembering the night everything imploded. When I confronted my parents with the spreadsheets, they did not apologize. They did not show an ounce of remorse. My mother looked at me with absolute disgust. She told me I was an ungrateful child who did not understand how real business worked. My father threatened me. When I told them I was legally obligated to report the discrepancies to the IRS, they panicked. They locked me out of the building that same night. I continued, my hands gripping the edge of the glass table. They revoked all my administrative credentials and wiped my hard drive. Before I could secure my own physical copies of the audit trails, they fabricated a series of wire transfers using my old login credentials. They moved $250,000 into a dummy account and framed me for the theft. They told me if I ever went to the authorities, they would hand their fabricated evidence over to the police and let me rot in prison. Then they started sending that email to every logistics and financial firm in the Midwest. They made sure I could never work in this industry again to guarantee I would never have the resources to fight them. Jonathan Pierce did not break eye contact. He did not show shock or sympathy. He simply absorbed the information, analyzing it with the cold calculation of a man who had built an empire from scratch. "And you survived for 2 years on your own," he stated rather than asked. "I survived," I replied, lifting my chin. "But I am done surviving, Mr. Pierce. If you brought me up here just to humiliate me with that email, then you have wasted both of our time. I am a brilliant analyst. I can optimize a supply chain better than anyone in your current department. But if you believe that piece of paper over the truth, then I have nothing left to say to you." I grabbed my purse and stood up from the leather chair. I accepted the defeat. I was used to it by now. I turned toward the heavy oak doors, fully prepared to walk back out into the freezing Chicago wind and figure out how I was going to pay my rent next week. "Sit down," Rachel, Jonathan commanded. I froze halfway to the door. I looked back at him. He was standing up from his chair, walking toward a large mahogany cabinet built into the wall behind his desk. "I said sit down!" He repeated, his tone, leaving no room for argument. I slowly walked back to the chair and sat down, my heart pounding against my ribs. Jonathan opened the cabinet to reveal a modern digital safe hidden behind the wood paneling. He typed in a long sequence of numbers and opened the heavy steel door. "I did not call you up to the executive suite to humiliate you, Rachel," he said, reaching into the safe. "I called you up here because I made a promise to a very formidable woman a long time ago." He walked back to this conference table and placed an object right next to the email my parents had written. It was an old, thick envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed with age. It was sealed shut with a heavy stamp of red wax. I leaned forward, staring at the wax seal. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the emblem pressed into the red wax. It was the original vintage logo of Apex Distribution, the logo my grandmother Beatrice had designed herself when she started the company with a single delivery truck 40 years ago. "Your grandmother Beatrice was a force of nature," Jonathan said, looking down at the sealed envelope. "She was a titan in the Chicago business world. She was also one of my earliest mentors when I was just starting Pierce Global. She taught me everything I know about logistics and corporate integrity." I stared at the envelope, unable to form a coherent sentence. My grandmother had passed away 10 years ago. She was the only person in my family who ever truly loved me. She was the one who paid for my accounting degree, who taught me how to read balance sheets when I was a teenager, who always protected me from my parents' toxic favoritism toward Madison. When she died suddenly from a stroke, my parents immediately took control of Apex and my life turned into a nightmare. "What is this?" I whispered, pointing at the envelope. "Your grandmother, Beatrice, gave me this 10 years ago," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a somber, respectful register. "It was just a few weeks before she passed away. She came to my office and handed me this envelope. She explicitly instructed me to lock it in my safe. She told me to never open it under any circumstances. She gave me one single incredibly specific instruction regarding this letter." He slid the envelope across the glass table until it touched my hands. "She told me to keep it sealed until the exact day you walked into my office asking for a job," Jonathan said, looking me right in the eyes. "I have waited 10 years for you to submit an application to Pierce Global, Rachel. I have been tracking your career. I knew about the blacklist email your parents circulated 2 years ago. I wanted to step in, but Beatrice made me swear on my life to wait until you came to me on your own terms." My hands were shaking violently as I picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy and fragile. "Open it," Jonathan commanded quietly. "It is time to find out what Beatrice left for you." My fingers slipped under the heavy wax seal of the envelope. The dried red wax snapped with a sharp crack that echoed in the vast boardroom. Inside rested a single piece of thick parchment paper covered in the elegant sweeping cursive I had not seen since I was a teenager. My eyes scanned the top of the page. "My dearest Rachel," my grandmother had written. "If Jonathan has handed this to you, then you have survived the worst of them. I am writing this letter because I know my son William and his wife Catherine better than they know themselves. I know they are greedy. I know they are incompetent. And most of all, I know they will try to destroy you because you possess the one thing they completely lack: integrity." I took a shaky breath, keeping my eyes glued to the paper. Beatrice's handwriting was steady and purposeful. "When I built Apex Distribution, I built it on hard work and honest accounting. But William looks at the company not as a legacy to protect, but as a personal bank account to drain. Catherine encourages his worst instincts. They favor Madison because she is just like them, willing to take the shortcuts, willing to flaunt wealth she did not earn. I knew that if I left the entire company to you directly, they would drag you into probate court for decades. They would bleed you dry with legal fees. They would use every dirty trick to strip you of your rightful inheritance. So I decided to play a different game. A game they are too short-sighted to ever understand." I looked up at Jonathan Pierce. He was leaning back in his leather chair, watching me absorb the words. He gestured toward the letter with his chin, urging me to finish. "I did not leave the commercial land that Apex Distribution operates on to William," my grandmother wrote. "I severed the real estate holding from the operational business entity. I placed 51% of those 30 prime acres into an irrevocable blind trust. Jonathan Pierce is the trustee. You, Rachel, are the sole and absolute beneficiary. William and Catherine own the business, but they do not own the ground they stand on. You do. Trust Jonathan. Take back what is yours." I set the letter down on the glass table. My mind was spinning, trying to process the massive legal and financial implications of what I had just read. A blind trust is a financial arrangement where the beneficiary has no knowledge of the specific assets, and the public has no way to trace the ownership back to the beneficiary. It is a bulletproof fortress of financial privacy. For 10 years, Jonathan said, his deep voice breaking the silence, your parents have been writing rent checks to the property management division of Pierce Global. They believe this corporation owns the commercial industrial park where Apex Distribution is headquartered. They have no idea that every single dollar of their lease agreement has been quietly filtering through our accounts and compounding in a private trust bearing your name. You are their landlord, Rachel. I stared at him. The sheer irony of the situation hit me with the force of a freight train. My parents had spent the last 2 years dragging my name through the mud. They had called me a thief. They had blackmailed and blacklisted me across the entire city of Chicago, forcing me to eat canned soup and dodge eviction notices. All while they were physically sitting inside a building that I technically owned. They were paying me rent while trying to starve me to death. Your grandmother was a brilliant strategist, Jonathan continued, leaning forward and resting his arms on the table. She knew William would eventually run the operational side of Apex into the ground. She knew he lacked the discipline to sustain a supply chain business in the modern market. She wanted to ensure that when the operational business inevitably failed, the underlying real assets, the real estate, the zoning rights, the physical infrastructure would remain completely untouched and safely in your possession. How much is in the trust account? I asked, my voice dropping to a low whisper. Jonathan opened a separate black folder on his desk. He slid a single sheet of paper toward me. It was a certified bank statement from Pierce Global Wealth Management. I looked at the bottom line. The balance was staggering. 10 years of commercial rent payments compounded with aggressive index fund investments had generated a massive fortune. I went from having $14 in my checking account to looking at an 8-figure liquid asset portfolio. But the cash is just the beginning, Jonathan said, his expression turning deadly serious. This brings us to the current situation. Your parents are completely out of money, Rachel. The lavish lifestyle they have been funding for Madison has finally caught up with them. The shell companies you discovered during your internal audit 2 years ago were just a temporary band-aid. Apex Distribution is currently experiencing a catastrophic liquidity crisis. He pulled out another stack of documents. These were stamped with bright red ink. These are delinquency notices, Jonathan explained. Apex has missed their last 3 rent payments. They are 90 days past due on their commercial lease. By all legal definitions, they are in default. I picked up the notices. My professional instincts immediately kicked in. If they are in default on a commercial lease of this size, they must be missing vendor payouts too. The supply chain must be collapsing. It is, Jonathan confirmed. But William thinks he has found a way out. He has been calling my office non-stop for the past month. He is desperate. He wants to aggressively buy the land out from under Pierce Global. I frowned, analyzing the strategy. That makes no sense. If they do not have the cash to pay their monthly rent, how could they possibly afford to purchase 30 acres of prime Chicago industrial real estate? Because they found a buyer, Jonathan said, a cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. The entire industrial corridor surrounding Apex is being gentrified. A massive commercial developer is trying to buy up the block to build a high-end tech campus. William negotiated a backdoor deal with the developers. He wants to purchase the land from Pierce Global for $5 million using a high-interest bridge loan. The very next day, he plans to flip that exact same land to the commercial developers for $15 million. He wants to pocket a $10 million profit, I said, realizing the sheer audacity of my father's plan. He wants to use that $10 million to plug the massive hole he and Catherine created in the company accounts. He wants to use it to cover up his tax fraud before the IRS notices the missing pension funds. Exactly, Jonathan said. William thinks I am just a busy CEO who views that land as a minor line item on a massive corporate balance sheet. He thinks he can bully or smooth-talk my real estate division into a quick, quiet sale. He thinks Pierce Global will just sign over the deed to get rid of a delinquent tenant. Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He set it on top of the delinquency notices. Then he slid the master deed of the property across the table. I am the trustee, Jonathan said, his gaze locking onto mine. But you are the sole beneficiary, and you are now 33 years old. According to the bylaws of the trust, you are of age to assume direct, unshielded control of the assets. If you pick up that pen and sign these papers, we take off the blindfold. You become the direct, public, legal owner of the Apex Distribution Headquarters. I stared at the gold pen. The metal gleamed under the harsh boardroom lights. You can evict them tomorrow morning, Jonathan said, his voice steady and resolute. You can order the sheriffs to lock the doors. You can freeze their entire operation. You can deny the sale to the developers and let William and Catherine drown in the debt they created. You can end them right now with a single signature, Rachel. I reached out and let my fingertips brush against the cool metal of the pen. For 2 years, I had dreamed of revenge. I had imagined 100 different ways to make my parents pay for what they did to me. I had suffered through freezing nights in a rundown apartment, crying myself to sleep because my own blood had branded me a criminal. The power to destroy them was quite literally at my fingertips. I could ruin William and Catherine with a stroke of ink. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The harsh vibration broke the heavy silence of the boardroom. I pulled the phone out. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was from Madison. My spoiled, entitled sister rarely contacted me unless she wanted to rub her wealth in my face or demand a favor. I opened the message. Thanksgiving dinner is at the main house this Thursday, Madison had written. Mom said you can come, but only if you use the back entrance. We need someone to help the catering staff wash the dishes after the actual family finishes eating. Do not wear those cheap clothes you had on last time. Brad's family will be there and we cannot have you looking like a homeless person. I stared at the glowing screen. Madison was engaged to Brad, a wealthy but superficial man from a prominent family. She was hosting Thanksgiving to show off her fake success. She wanted me there to serve as the punchline to her jokes. She wanted to humiliate the unemployed sister in front of her high society guests. I slowly placed the phone face up on the glass table. I looked at the text message. Then I looked at the gold pen. Finally, I looked up at Jonathan Pierce. I pushed the pen back across the table. Are you declining the trust? Jonathan asked, his brow furrowing in slight confusion. No, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy calm. I am accepting every single asset my grandmother left me. But I am not signing those papers today. Jonathan leaned back, crossing his arms. Explain. Ending them with a piece of paper from a boardroom is too easy, I said, standing up from the chair. My posture was rigid. The defeated, desperate woman who had walked into this office an hour ago was dead. In her place was the rightful owner of a multi-million-dollar estate. If I evict them tomorrow, they will just spin a new lie. They will tell their country club friends that a greedy corporation forced them out. They will play the victims. They will hide behind their fake wealth and pretend it was a business tragedy. I picked up my coat and slipped it on. I am going to that Thanksgiving dinner, Mr. Pierce, I said, looking down at the legal documents. My parents and my sister love to put on a show. They love an audience. So I am going to give them exactly what they want. I am going to let them sit at the head of the table. I am going to let them boast about their success. I am going to let them think they have won. A slow, calculating smile spread across Jonathan's face. He understood perfectly. I want to look them in the eyes when the ground collapses beneath their feet, I said, buttoning my coat. I want to watch them dig their own graves in front of everyone they are trying to impress. Prepare the transfer documents, Mr. Pierce. I will be back to sign them next week, but first I have a holiday dinner to attend. Driving up the winding driveway of my parents' suburban estate in Oak Brook always felt like entering an alternate reality. The massive wrought iron gates swung open to reveal a meticulously manicured lawn that cost more to maintain in a single month than I had earned in the last 2 years. I parked my rusted 10-year-old sedan at the very edge of the long cobblestone driveway, deliberately keeping it hidden in the shadows, far away from the gleaming luxury vehicles lined up near the grand front steps. I stepped out into the freezing November air, pulling my thin wool coat tighter around my shoulders. The front door burst open before I even reached the porch. Madison stood there framed by the warm golden light of the grand foyer, holding a crystal champagne flute. She wore a stunning emerald silk designer dress that clung to her perfectly sculpted figure. Behind her, the sprawling house buzzed with the loud, arrogant laughter of people who believed their wealth made them untouchable. Madison did not offer a greeting or a welcoming smile. Instead, she pointed her champagne flute toward the center of the driveway. "You parked too far away, Rachel," she mocked, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. "You almost missed the main attraction." I followed her gaze. Sitting in the most prominent spot in the circular driveway under the glare of the exterior floodlights was a brand new Porsche Panamera. The paint was a deep metallic black that seemed to absorb the light entirely. It still had the temporary dealer tags taped to the windshield. "Beautiful, is it not?" Madison asked, her voice dripping with sheer entitlement. "A little reward to myself. A CFO bonus for closing out a spectacular quarter at Apex Distribution. Dad said my financial restructuring saved the company from a major slump, so he authorized the payout immediately." I looked at the car. A $120,000 luxury vehicle bought by a 29-year-old woman who could not even read a basic balance sheet without a calculator. 2 years ago, I was the one doing the financial restructuring. I was the one finding the massive bleeding leaks in the operational budget. Now the company was 90 days delinquent on their commercial lease, facing total eviction, and my sister was bragging about a cash bonus that did not actually exist. I heard the heavy crunch of footsteps on the frost-covered walkway. Jamal stepped out of the shadows of the wraparound porch. Jamal was Madison's husband. He was 31 years old, a brilliantly sharp Black American tax attorney who always carried himself with a quiet, composed dignity. His presence always felt entirely out of place in my loud, abrasive family. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and held a simple glass of sparkling water. Jamal never drank alcohol at these family functions. I always suspected he needed a perfectly clear head to navigate the endless minefield of microaggressions my parents constantly threw his way. "Good evening, Rachel," Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice cutting through Madison's shrill boasting. "I am glad you could make it." He extended a hand and I shook it. His grip was firm and grounding. He looked at my thin, worn coat and then at the freezing winter wind whipping around us. "Let us get you inside," he said, gesturing toward the open door. "It is freezing out here." Madison rolled her eyes dramatically. "Do not coddle her, Jamal. She is used to the cold. I mean, look at that coat. Did you buy that at a charity thrift store, Rachel? I thought I told you Brad's parents were coming tonight. We cannot have you looking like a charity case in front of his family." I did not respond to the bait. I simply walked past her and stepped into the grand foyer of the house. The overwhelming heat of the mansion hit me instantly. The rich smell of roasted turkey and expensive imported spices filled the air. My mother, Catherine, was standing in the center of the massive chef's kitchen, directing a team of hired caterers with the ruthless efficiency of a dictator. She wore a stunning velvet gown and a diamond necklace that caught the light with every sharp movement of her head. She turned and saw me standing in the hallway. Her face immediately contorted into a mask of pure disgust. "You are late," Catherine snapped, marching toward me. "And what on earth are you wearing?" I told Madison to make sure you understood the formal dress code. I took off my coat, revealing a simple but clean black dress. "It is appropriate for a holiday dinner," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. Catherine snatched the coat from my hands and tossed it onto a nearby chair with a huff of profound irritation. "It looks cheap," she hissed, leaning in close so the catering staff would not hear her venomous tone. "Brad's family comes from old money, Rachel. They own half the commercial real estate in the city. I will not have my disgraced unemployed daughter making us look like commoners. Take this." She shoved a stiff white linen apron against my chest. "Since you insist on showing up and eating our food, you can make yourself useful," Catherine ordered. "The catering staff is overwhelmed. I need you to take the trays of caviar appetizers and serve them in the main living room. Keep your head down, do not strike up any conversations, and for heaven's sake, do not mention your employment status. If anyone asks, you are doing freelance consulting overseas." I looked down at the white apron in my hands. 10 years ago, my grandmother Beatrice built this family empire from absolutely nothing. She taught me that true power was always quiet. She taught me that people who felt a desperate need to degrade others were usually hiding a massive, catastrophic weakness. I thought about the legal documents locked in Jonathan Pierce's unbreachable steel safe. I thought about the eviction notices stamped in bright red ink. I thought about the $15 million commercial land deal my parents were desperately trying to close to save themselves from total bankruptcy. I took the apron from my mother's hands and tied it carefully around my waist. "I will serve the appetizers," I said, offering her a polite, empty smile. Catherine looked momentarily shocked by my total compliance. She had fully expected a fight. She had wanted a screaming match so she could kick me out into the snow and play the grieving victim for her wealthy guests. When I simply agreed, she scoffed, turned on her designer heel, and marched back into the kitchen, barking orders at a terrified waiter. I picked up a heavy silver tray loaded with intricate caviar bites and walked into the massive living room. The space was packed with wealthy guests holding crystal glasses and talking loudly over each other. My father, William, stood by the grand stone fireplace holding court with Brad's parents. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit and gesturing expansively as he talked about his latest luxury golf trip. "Ah, here are the appetizers," William announced loudly as I approached their elite circle. He did not look at me. He did not introduce me to his guests. He treated me exactly like a hired servant. I held the tray steady as Brad's mother, a woman draped in expensive silk, picked up a small pastry. She glanced at me without making eye contact. "Your catering staff is very attentive, William," she murmured before turning back to my father. "So tell me more about the expansion plans for Apex Distribution. My husband mentioned you were looking at acquiring new warehouse space. We are positioning the company for a major acquisition phase," William boasted, taking a long sip of his premium bourbon. "We have secured massive capital reserves. My CFO, Madison, has completely streamlined our operational budget this year. The profit margins this quarter are unprecedented. We have more liquid cash than we know what to do with." I stood there holding the heavy silver tray, listening to my father lie through his teeth with absolute perfection. Apex Distribution was bleeding cash. They were drowning in insurmountable debt. They were 90 days behind on their commercial rent. The sheer audacity of his lies was breathtaking. From across the room, I felt someone watching me. I turned my head slightly and met Jamal's gaze. He was standing near the grand mahogany staircase, holding his glass of water, his dark, intelligent eyes tracking every single movement in the room. Jamal was a brilliant tax attorney. He spent his long days analyzing complex financial structures, finding obscure tax loopholes, and reading dense corporate balance sheets. He was highly trained to spot inconsistencies. And the inconsistencies in this sprawling mansion were piling up fast. Jamal watched as Madison paraded around the living room, showing off the shiny keys to her new Porsche to anyone who would look. He watched as William bragged about unprecedented profit margins to investors. He watched as Catherine viciously berated the catering staff for pouring the wrong vintage of wine. And he watched me. He saw how I carried the serving tray with quiet dignity, refusing to break under the crushing weight of my parents' public humiliation. He knew I had been a top-tier auditor. He knew I had a relentless mind for numbers and an obsession with accurate data. 2 years ago, when my parents accused me of embezzling $250,000, Jamal had stayed quiet. He had just married into the family and did not want to cause a massive rift. But I knew he never fully believed their convenient story. The math simply did not make sense to a man who lived and breathed financial law. I continued moving through the crowded room, serving the appetizers and listening to the arrogant chatter. Madison intercepted me near the hallway leading to the dining room. She grabbed a caviar bite from my tray and chewed it slowly, looking me up and down with pure malice. "You know you actually look good in an apron, Rachel," she mocked, her voice laced with venom. "It suits your station in life. Maybe I can talk to the catering company and get you a full-time job scraping plates. You desperately need the money, right? I hear your landlord is threatening eviction again." I maintained my perfectly neutral expression, refusing to give her the reaction she craved. I am doing just fine, Madison, I said, my voice smooth and calm. But thank you for your concern. Enjoy the new Porsche. I hope the expensive maintenance costs do not cut into your fictional CFO bonus. Madison's eyes flashed with sudden intense anger, but she quickly smoothed her features as Brad walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Brad was a venture capitalist, a man whose entire personality was built around his massive trust fund. He looked at me with an amused, arrogant smirk. "Still looking for work, Rachel?" he asked, his tone dripping with heavy condescension. "Let me know if you need me to make some calls. I know a few low-level temp agencies that hire people with challenging criminal backgrounds. They mostly do data entry, but it is a paycheck." I smiled tightly, gripping the edges of the silver tray. "I appreciate the offer, Brad," I said, "but I have recently secured a very promising position. In fact, I think my new role will involve restructuring some major commercial real estate assets right here in Chicago." Brad laughed, clearly missing the underlying threat embedded in my words. "Good for you," he said, turning back to Madison. "Come on, babe, your dad is opening the expensive wine in the dining room." As Brad led Madison away, she turned sharply on her heel. The sudden movement caused her designer handbag to swing outward, brushing against the edge of a heavy marble console table. The gold clasp caught on the sharp stone corner, snapping open violently. A handful of items spilled out of the bag and clattered onto the polished hardwood floor. Lipstick, a compact mirror, a silver card holder, and several crumpled pieces of paper scattered across the ground. Madison cursed loudly under her breath and knelt down to gather her things. Jamal, who had been walking toward the dining room, immediately stepped forward to help his wife. I stood a few feet away, holding my silver tray, watching the interaction unfold with intense focus. Jamal reached down to pick up a crumpled white receipt that had fluttered near his expensive leather shoes. As his long fingers brushed the paper, he froze completely. I saw his dark eyes dart across the printed text. I saw his jaw clench so tightly, a muscle jumped in his cheek. I saw the exact terrifying moment his brilliant analytical mind connected the scattered pieces of a massive catastrophic puzzle. Madison snatched the compact mirror and the lipstick, shoving them aggressively back into her bag. "Give me that, Jamal," she snapped, reaching her hand out for the receipt. Jamal did not hand it over immediately. He stared at the piece of paper, his thumb tracing the printed corporate logo at the very top. His expression was completely unreadable, but the air around him seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. "What is this, Madison?" he asked, his deep voice stripped of all warmth and emotion. "It is just a receipt for the car," she said, her voice pitching slightly higher than normal, revealing her sudden panic. "Just give it to me." I watched Jamal's eyes scan the paper again. I knew exactly what he was looking at. The receipt was not a standard personal dealership invoice. It was a corporate charge authorization. Madison had not used a personal bank check or a standard auto loan to buy the $120,000 Porsche. She had used the primary corporate credit line of Apex Distribution. She had charged a luxury sports car directly to the operational budget of a medical supply company. For a federal tax attorney, this was not just a red flag. It was a blazing, deafening siren of severe corporate fraud. Buying a personal luxury vehicle with company funds and masking it as a CFO bonus was a massive violation of federal tax codes. It was blatant embezzlement. It was exactly the kind of financial crime my parents had accused me of committing 2 years ago to cover their own tracks. Jamal slowly handed the receipt back to his wife. His dark eyes lifted from the crumpled paper and locked directly onto my face. I stood perfectly still, holding the catering tray, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. The silence between us stretched across the crowded, loud room, cutting through the noise of the party. In that single defining moment, Jamal realized the absolute truth. He looked at his wife, bragging about her fake wealth. He looked at my parents, boasting about their fake profits to investors. And then he looked at me, the disgraced, exiled sister, quietly serving appetizers in a cheap black dress. He knew. He finally knew that I had not stolen a single dime from Apex Distribution 2 years ago. He knew that I had found the deep rot in the company ledgers and that my parents had framed me to cover up their own massive financial crimes. Jamal stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit. He looked at me one last time, a silent, intense communication passing clearly between us. He had seen through the glittering facade. He knew the entire family empire was built on a crumbling mountain of fraud. And as I watched him turn and walk quietly toward the dining room away from his panicking wife, I knew I had just found the one powerful ally I needed to bring the whole operation crashing down. The clinking of expensive crystal and the low hum of arrogant conversation filled the sprawling dining room. I remained at my post near the swinging kitchen doors, holding the empty silver catering tray against my hip. I watched Jamal take his seat next to Madison. His face was a masterclass in absolute composure. Not a single muscle betrayed the explosive realization he had just experienced in the foyer. He simply unfolded his pristine linen napkin and placed it quietly on his lap. His dark, intelligent eyes occasionally flicked toward William at the head of the table, observing the patriarch of the family with the clinical detachment of a prosecutor building a federal case. The Thanksgiving meal was a grotesque display of gluttony and fake wealth. Caterers rushed back and forth, carrying massive silver platters of roasted turkey, truffle, mashed potatoes, and imported wine. I stood in the shadows of the dining room archway, doing exactly what my mother had ordered. I kept my head down. I watched my family gorge themselves on food paid for by fraudulent corporate credit lines. William held court with Brad and his wealthy parents, boasting loudly about imaginary warehouse acquisitions and projected fourth-quarter revenues. Madison sat beside Brad, twisting her massive diamond engagement ring and loudly complaining about the heavy tax burden of being a highly paid corporate executive. Catherine played the perfect high society hostess, smiling sweetly and directing the hired help with sharp flicks of her manicured fingers. Nobody offered me a plate. Nobody asked if I wanted a glass of water. I was entirely invisible to them until I was no longer useful. When the dessert plates were finally cleared and the wealthy guests began moving toward the parlor for after-dinner drinks, Catherine suddenly materialized beside me. Her fake smile vanished the second we were out of eyesight of Brad's parents. She grabbed my upper arm, her fingernails digging painfully into my skin through the thin fabric of my black dress. "Put the tray down," she hissed, her breath smelling sharply of expensive champagne. "Go to your father's private study, right now. Do not speak to anyone on your way there." I gently pulled my arm out of her painful grip. I placed the silver tray on the nearest counter and smoothed down the front of my dress. I did not ask questions. I simply turned and walked down the long, dimly lit corridor that led to the west wing of the estate. William's private study was designed to look like the office of a self-made billionaire. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes he had never bothered to read. A massive Persian rug covered the hardwood floor. At the center of the room sat a massive antique mahogany desk. The air smelled heavily of aged scotch and expensive cigar smoke. I stepped inside the room. William was already sitting behind his desk. Catherine walked in right behind me and pushed the heavy oak doors shut. I heard the distinct metallic click of the brass lock engaging. I was officially cornered. "Sit down," Rachel William ordered, pointing to one of the rigid leather chairs positioned directly across from his desk. He did not sound angry. He sounded falsely benevolent, which was infinitely more dangerous. I remained standing. "I prefer to stand," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "What do you want?" William sighed heavily, rubbing his temples as if dealing with a stubborn toddler. He opened a sleek leather folder on his desk and pulled out a stack of crisp legal documents. He aligned the edges of the paper with methodical precision. "Your mother and I have been discussing your unfortunate situation." He began, his voice dripping with fake paternal concern. "We know the last 2 years have been incredibly difficult for you. We know you have been struggling to find employment. We know you are barely scraping by in that tiny, miserable condo downtown." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his words was staggering. I was struggling because they had systematically blacklisted me across the entire city of Chicago. They had intentionally starved me out of the corporate sector. "We want to help you," Catherine chimed in, moving to stand directly behind William's leather chair. She placed her hands on his shoulders, offering me a sickeningly sweet smile. "You are our daughter, after all. We do not want to see you living in poverty. I crossed my arms over my chest. Cut the performance, I said sharply. You locked the door. You brought out legal documents. You do not want to help me. You want something from me. Tell me what it is so I can leave. William's fake smile completely vanished. His eyes hardened, turning cold and transactional. He slid the stack of legal papers across the polished mahogany surface toward the edge of the desk. Apex Distribution is undergoing a brief business expansion. William stated, his tone shifting into his aggressive corporate negotiating voice. We are finalizing a massive acquisition deal next week that will double our operational capacity. However, because the expansion is happening so rapidly, we have a temporary liquidity gap. We need a short-term bridge loan to finalize the paperwork. I looked down at the documents sitting on the edge of the desk. I did not need to pick them up to know exactly what they were. I was a former top-tier supply chain analyst and a highly trained auditor. I could read a standard commercial collateral agreement upside down from 3 feet away. You want my condo? I said, my voice dropping to a low, disbelieving whisper. It is just a temporary collateral assignment, Catherine said, quickly waving her hand, as if she were swatting away a fly. We just need to pledge the deed of your downtown property to a private lender to secure the bridge loan. We will release the lien in 6 months once the expansion capital starts flowing. You will not even notice a difference. In exchange, we will give you a generous monthly stipend so you can stop begging for freelance work. I stared at the two of them. For a moment, the absolute absurdity of the situation robbed me of my ability to speak. I had purchased that small, modest one-bedroom condo 5 years ago with my own hard-earned savings. It was the only asset I had managed to protect when my parents launched their campaign to destroy my life. I had survived on ramen noodles and skipped meals just to make sure I never missed a single mortgage payment on that property. And now my parents, who were currently standing in a multi-million-dollar mansion, surrounded by luxury cars and high society guests, were asking me to hand over the only roof I had over my head. A sound bubbled up from my throat. I tried to suppress it, but I could not. I threw my head back and laughed. It was a cold, genuine, echoing laugh that bounced off the mahogany walls of the study. I laughed until my chest ached. I looked at the two multimillionaires sitting across from me, begging their unemployed, disgraced daughter for a real estate handout. William slammed his fist down on the desk, making the heavy crystal ashtray rattle. "This is not a joke, Rachel," he roared, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "We are offering you a lifeline. You are offering me an anchor to tie around my neck before you throw me in the river." I shot back the laughter, instantly draining from my voice. "You are sitting in a $10 million estate. Madison is driving a brand new Porsche Panamera. You just fed 50 people imported caviar and truffles, and you are asking the daughter you blacklisted for the deed to a 400-square-foot condo." I stepped closer to the desk, leaning over the stack of legal documents. "You do not have a brief business expansion, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. "You have a catastrophic cash flow crisis. The shell companies are drying up. The lenders have cut you off. You cannot secure a traditional bank loan because any legitimate loan officer would look at your fraudulent balance sheets and instantly call the authorities. You are completely out of money." Catherine's face twisted into a mask of pure, vicious rage. The sweet maternal facade disintegrated entirely. She stepped out from behind the desk, marching right up to my face. "You ungrateful, arrogant little wretch!" Catherine snarled, her voice dropping to a venomous hiss. "You will sign those papers right now. You owe us. We gave you everything. We raised you. We fed you. We paid for your entire existence. I paid for my own college tuition. I fired back, refusing to back down an inch. And I paid for my own condo. You gave me nothing but a target on my back." Catherine's eyes widened with manic fury. She pointed a sharp, trembling finger directly at my chest. "If you do not pick up that pen and sign that collateral agreement right now, I will make your current miserable life look like a vacation," she threatened, her voice shaking with raw malice. "I know exactly who your current landlord is. I will call him tomorrow morning. I will tell him you are a convicted thief. I will tell him you are under federal investigation for embezzlement. I will have you thrown out onto the freezing streets before the end of the week. I will ruin your credit score permanently. I will make sure you starve in the gutters of this city." William stood up from his leather chair, towering over the desk. "You have no leverage here, Rachel," he barked, his fists clenched at his sides. "You are a nobody. You have no job. You have no reputation. You have no power. We are handing you a chance to be useful to this family for the first time in your miserable life. You should be down on your knees thanking us for giving you an opportunity to earn back our grace. Sign the document." I looked at my mother, whose face was contorted with pure hatred. I looked at my father, whose chest was heaving with desperate, angry breaths. They really believed they held all the cards. They really believed they had backed me into a corner I could never escape. I slowly placed my hands flat on the polished mahogany surface of William's desk. I leaned my weight forward, closing the physical distance between us. I did not yell. I did not scream. I looked my father dead in the eyes with absolute terrifying calm. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "And you should be very careful making threats you cannot afford to back up, Dad." William sneered, showing his teeth. "I can afford to destroy you 10 times over." "Can you?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Because an hour ago, I watched Madison drop a corporate charge receipt on the hardwood floor of your hallway. A receipt for a $120,000 luxury vehicle charged directly to the operational budget of Apex Distribution." William stopped breathing. The angry red flush on his face vanished entirely, replaced by a sickly pale gray. Catherine took a sudden panicked step backward, her high heel stumbling on the edge of the Persian rug. I held my father's terrified gaze, refusing to let him look away. "You might want to rethink your aggressive business strategies, Dad," I said, my voice echoing softly in the dead silence of the study. "Because the IRS tends to heavily audit companies that buy Porsches as office supplies." William turned absolutely ghost white. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. The powerful, intimidating billionaire patriarch had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate fraud staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. I did not wait for William to find his voice or for Catherine to recover from her panicked stumbling. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving them suffocating in the toxic, freezing air of their own ruined study. The satisfying heavy click of the brass lock disengaging behind me felt like a starting pistol firing into the night sky. The war was officially on, and they had absolutely no idea how heavily outgunned they truly were. While I was delivering my ultimatum in the West Wing, another quiet, devastating confrontation was actively brewing in the grand hallway. Jamal had not returned to the dining room to finish his meal. He stood in the shadowed alcove near the lavish coat check, the crumpled white receipt, burning a figurative hole in his tailored suit pocket. Jamal was a man who lived his entire life by strict rules, rigid structures, and absolute adherence to federal statutes. Growing up as a black man in a working-class neighborhood on the South Side, he had learned very early that the margin of error for someone who looked like him was non-existent. He had to be twice as smart, 3 times as careful, and infinitely more disciplined to break into the elite, fiercely competitive circles of corporate tax law. He knew the devastating cost of a single financial mistake. He knew the catastrophic power of an IRS audit. And right now, the small piece of paper resting in his pocket was the equivalent of a federal crime printed in black ink. Madison came strutting down the hallway, her emerald silk dress swishing aggressively around her legs. She was frantically retracing her steps, looking for her lost receipt. Her eyes darted nervously across the polished hardwood floor, her breathing shallow and fast. Jamal stepped out of the dark alcove, his tall frame entirely blocking her path to the grand foyer. "Looking for this?" Madison, Jamal asked, holding the crumpled paper between his index and middle fingers. Madison gasped, her hand flying to her chest in a theatrical display of relief. "Oh, thank goodness you found it," she said, reaching out quickly to snatch the paper from his grip. "I must have dropped it when my bag hit the table. Give it to me." Jamal did not hand it over. Instead, he pulled his hand back, raising the paper to his eye level. His dark, intelligent eyes locked onto his wife's face with a chilling intensity. "This is a corporate charge authorization, Madison," Jamal said, his deep voice stripped of all its usual warmth. "For a $120,000 luxury sports car, charged directly to the operational supply budget of Apex Distribution. You did not buy this car with a personal bonus check. You bought it with company funds." Madison rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh of profound irritation. She crossed her arms over her chest, tapping her designer heel impatiently against the floorboards. "It is a CFO bonus, Jamal," she snapped, her voice pitching higher with defensive arrogance. "Dad authorized the payout himself. Stop acting like a low-level paranoid auditor. You do not understand how real corporate wealth operates. We move money around all the time to maximize our tax benefits. It is perfectly legal." Jamal felt a muscle jump tightly in his jaw. The sheer, blinding ignorance of her statement was staggering. "You cannot disguise a personal luxury vehicle as a corporate operational expense to avoid capital gains and luxury taxes," Jamal explained, speaking slowly and clearly, as if explaining fire to a child. "If the IRS flags this specific transaction, they will not classify it as a creative accounting error. They will classify it as willful, intentional embezzlement. You are the chief financial officer of the company, Madison. Your personal signature is on the corporate ledger. You will be the one facing federal indictment, not your father." "You are being completely ridiculous," Madison hissed, her face flushing an ugly shade of red. "Dad knows what he is doing. He has accountants who handle all the annoying paperwork. Just give me the receipt and go back to the party before you ruin my mood." Before Jamal could respond to her blatant dismissal, heavy, aggressive footsteps echoed down the hallway. William, fresh from the study and seething with violent, uncontainable rage from my earlier threat, stormed over to them. His face was still a dangerous shade of crimson, and his fists were tightly clenched at his sides. He saw Jamal holding the receipt and immediately marched into Jamal's personal space, attempting to use his physical presence to intimidate his son-in-law. "Is there a problem here?" William barked, his voice laced with venomous authority. "Why are you harassing my daughter in the middle of our holiday party?" Jamal did not back down an inch. He stood his ground, looking down at his father-in-law with absolute unwavering calm. "I am asking my wife why she is committing federal tax fraud to finance a sports car," Jamal stated evenly, holding the receipt up for William to see. "This purchase is a direct violation of the corporate tax code. If the authorities audit Apex Distribution, Madison will be held personally liable for misappropriation of corporate funds. I am trying to protect her from going to federal prison." William snatched the receipt from Jamal's hand, crushing it into a tight ball in his fist. He glared at Jamal, his eyes filled with a toxic mixture of classism, racism, and pure unfiltered arrogance. "You listen to me very carefully," William snarled, stepping so close that Jamal could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. "You are a tax attorney, Jamal. You are a paper pusher. You bill by the hour to clean up the messes of men like me. You sit in a little cubicle and highlight rule books because you lack the actual stomach for high-level aggressive business maneuvering." Jamal remained perfectly silent, absorbing the insult with a stoic expression, letting William expose his true putrid character. "In this family, we make real money." William continued, jabbing a thick finger hard against Jamal's chest. "We build empires. We do not cower in fear over some minor bureaucratic red tape. Do not question my daughter's finances just because your working-class background makes you terrified of taking risks. You married into a completely different league. You get to wear those expensive suits and eat at this table because I allow it. Learn your place in this house, or pack your bags and go back to whichever neighborhood you crawled out of." The racial and class-based microaggressions hit exactly as William intended. It was a blatant, undeniable reminder that William viewed Jamal not as a son-in-law, not as an equal partner to Madison, but as a prop. A respectable, highly educated black man they could parade around to show their progressive social standing while secretly viewing him as entirely beneath them. Jamal slowly turned his head to look at Madison. He waited for his wife to step in. He waited for her to defend their marriage, to reprimand her father for the blatant, disgusting disrespect he had just displayed. He expected the woman he loved to draw a firm boundary and stand by his side. Instead, Madison crossed her arms tighter and offered a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "Dad is right, Jamal Madison," said her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Stop trying to drag us down to your boring bureaucratic level. You are always so anxious about rules and regulations. It is frankly embarrassing. Go get a drink, mingle with the guests, and relax. You are ruining the holiday for everyone with your constant complaining." In that exact freezing moment, the illusion completely shattered. The heavy, invisible chain of loyalty that Jamal had carried for years instantly snapped. Jamal looked at his wife, truly seeing her for the very first time. She was not a vibrant, ambitious woman who occasionally made naive mistakes. She was a greedy complicit and fundamentally corrupt fraud. She would happily watch her father disrespect her husband, and she would gladly let Jamal take the fall if her financial crimes ever caught up to her. He was nothing but a legal shield to her, a convenient safety net to deploy when her reckless entitlement caused a disaster. The profound clarity of the betrayal washed over Jamal, leaving behind a cold, mechanical focus. He was a man of the law, and he was currently standing in a house full of arrogant criminals who believed they were utterly invincible. "You are absolutely right," Jamal said, lowering his head and feigning total submission. His voice was smooth, stripping away any hint of his internal rage. "I apologize, William. I overstepped my bounds. It is not my place to question the financial operations of Apex Distribution. I will go get a drink and mingle with the guests. Please excuse me." William grunted in satisfaction, puffing out his chest, thoroughly pleased with his ability to command obedience. Madison smiled, clearly thrilled to have won the argument without having to exert any actual effort. They turned their backs on him and walked toward the dining room, completely dismissing his existence. Jamal walked away, blending perfectly into the background of the lavish party. He did not go to the bar. He did not mingle with Brad's wealthy, pretentious parents. Instead, he moved silently through the crowded corridors, slipping unnoticed into the dark, empty library, located just down the hall from William's private study. He closed the heavy doors silently behind him and locked them. He stood in the pitch-black room surrounded by unread books and antique globes and pulled his encrypted smartphone from his jacket pocket. Jamal was a highly technical attorney. 2 years ago, when William complained about the slow internet speeds in the mansion, Jamal had personally upgraded the commercial-grade routers for the estate. He knew the exact architecture of the home network. More importantly, he knew William's incredibly lazy, predictable administrative passwords. William was a man who believed his wealth made him immune to cyber threats, leaving his private home office desktop completely unsecured on the shared network. Jamal connected his phone to the mansion's primary Wi-Fi. His fingers flew across the digital keyboard with practiced, terrifying speed. He bypassed the basic firewall and accessed the shared network drive hosted on the desktop in the study next door. The screen of his phone illuminated his face in the dark library. A list of internal directories populated on his screen. He scrolled rapidly, his eyes scanning the file names. He bypassed the personal photos and generic legal templates, searching for the core data. He found a heavily nested folder labeled with a vague, unassuming title. He tapped it. Inside the folder were hundreds of meticulously organized spreadsheets, PDF documents, wire transfer receipts, and offshore banking confirmations. They were labeled with dates stretching back nearly a decade. This was the master ledger. This was the unedited, raw financial data of Apex Distribution, completely free of the sanitized lies William handed over to the external auditors. Jamal initiated a massive silent download directly to his secure encrypted cloud server. He watched the loading bar appear on his screen, creeping steadily across the digital interface. The mansion's high-speed internet made the transfer incredibly fast. 10%, 30%, 60%. He watched the data flow, capturing every single piece of evidence regarding the fake shell companies, the embezzled pension funds, and the fraudulent corporate expenses used to buy Madison's luxury vehicles. He was downloading the precise coordinates of their complete financial destruction. 100%. Download complete. Jamal closed the connection, wiped his access history from the router logs, and locked his phone. He slipped the device securely back into his tailored suit pocket. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothed his tie, and unlocked the library doors. He stepped back out into the bright, loud hallway, seamlessly rejoining the Thanksgiving celebration. The obedient, disrespected son-in-law was officially gone. The federal whistleblower had just entered the game, holding the exact weapons needed to burn their entire empire straight to the ground. 1,600 words. I remained completely still near the swinging kitchen doors, holding the empty silver catering tray against my hip. I watched Jamal walk back into the crowded dining room. His face was a masterclass in absolute composure. Not a single muscle betrayed the explosive realization he had just experienced in the grand foyer. He simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket and blended perfectly back into the wealthy crowd of oblivious guests. I knew my parting words to William in the private study had lit an uncontrollable fuse. I was just waiting for the massive explosion to tear through the mansion. It did not take long for the detonation to occur. The heavy oak doors of the West Wing flew open with a violent, resounding crash. The sharp sound echoed through the sprawling estate, slicing through the polite, aristocratic chatter and the soft, classical music playing from the hidden surround sound speakers. William marched down the long corridor toward the main dining area. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was not walking like a sophisticated, wealthy host. He was storming like a cornered, wounded animal. Catherine trailed dangerously close behind him, her heavy velvet gown swishing frantically against the hardwood floor as she struggled to keep up with his aggressive, pounding strides. I braced myself, gripping the rigid edges of the silver catering tray so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I refused to break eye contact as my father approached. William bypassed the elite guests mingling in the parlor. He ignored Brad and his affluent parents who were sipping imported brandy by the massive stone fireplace. He made a direct, aggressive beeline for the dining room archway where I stood. He did not care about social decorum anymore. He did not care about keeping up appearances for his investors. The explicit threat of an IRS audit had completely shattered his carefully constructed facade of aristocratic grace. Panic had overridden his common sense. "Everyone look at this ungrateful wretch!" William bellowed, his deep voice booming aggressively across the grand living room. He pointed a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. The entire holiday party ground to a sudden, terrifying halt. The classical music seemed to fade entirely into the background. Dozens of high society guests turned their heads, their expensive crystal glasses suspended mid-air. Madison gasped loudly, clutching Brad's arm tightly, her eyes darting between me and her furious father. Jamal stood near the edge of the crowd, his face remaining an unreadable mask of absolute calm calculation. William stepped so incredibly close to me, I could smell the sharp, bitter tang of expensive scotch on his panicked breath. He leaned forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "We opened our beautiful home to her," William shouted, ensuring every single guest in the mansion could hear his fabricated victimhood. "We fed her. We gave her a place at our holiday table despite everything she has done to destroy this family. And how does she repay our profound generosity? She tries to extort us. She demands money and threatens to ruin our business if we do not pay her off." Shocked whispers erupted immediately across the lavish room. Brad's mother placed a delicate hand over her pearl necklace, looking at me with profound, unfiltered disgust. The guests were eating up the lies exactly as William intended. "Extortion," Catherine echoed, stepping up beside my father and adopting a look of theatrical, agonizing heartbreak. She played her manipulative role perfectly, wiping an imaginary tear from her eye with a shaking hand. "We offered her a lifeline today. We offered to help her get back on her feet after she ruined her own career with her criminal behavior, and she demanded a massive cash payout. She threatened to call the authorities and invent vicious lies about this family if we did not hand over our hard-earned money." I stared at my parents. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was breathtaking to witness. They were desperately trying to flip the narrative right in front of their most important investors. They were actively trying to paint me as a desperate, deranged blackmailer to discredit anything I might say about their financial crimes. If they convinced their wealthy friends that I was a crazy extortionist, no one would believe me when the absolute truth about the blind trust and the commercial land lease finally came out. They were playing defense by going on the offensive. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I stood perfectly straight, holding the silver tray like a battle shield. I let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment, forcing everyone to wait for my response. "I did not ask you for a single dime, Dad," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the dead silent room. "You dragged me into your locked private study and demanded I sign over the deed to my downtown condo. You begged me to hand over my only remaining asset so you could use it as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan." The whispers in the room instantly shifted in tone. The wealthy guests exchanged confused, uneasy glances. A billionaire CEO begging his unemployed, disgraced daughter for her modest condo. It made absolutely no logical sense to anyone with a basic understanding of corporate finance. William's face turned a violent shade of purple. "Shut your mouth," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You are a pathological liar. You are a convicted thief. Nobody in this room believes a single word that comes out of your mouth. You are nothing but a jealous failure trying to drag us down." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, completely closing the physical distance between us. I dropped the catering tray onto the nearest mahogany side table. The heavy silver crashed against the solid wood, making several nearby guests jump in alarm. I looked directly at Brad's father, the commercial real estate investor, making sure my words carried specifically to his ears. "I am not lying," I stated, my voice dropping to a deadly, chilling register. "And you do not have a brief business expansion planned. You are completely out of cash. Apex Distribution is bleeding money from every single operational pore. You are using corporate credit lines to buy luxury sports cars for a chief financial officer who does not even know how to file a basic quarterly tax return. You are dodging commercial lease payments. You are drowning in massive, insurmountable debt. Your entire empire is built entirely on fraudulent balance sheets and stolen employee pension funds." The silence that followed my words was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that only occurs right before a catastrophic impact. Brad's father, a man who had invested heavily in local commercial real estate, narrowed his eyes, staring at William with sudden, sharp suspicion. The atmosphere in the room changed from dramatic entertainment to serious financial concern. William saw the distinct look of doubt on his primary investor's face. He saw his carefully crafted reputation actively disintegrating in front of his elite peers. He saw the absolute truth shining brightly in my eyes, and he knew he could not simply lie his way out of it anymore. The walls were closing in on him. He lost total control. William raised his large right hand and swung it with all his furious, desperate strength. The slap echoed like a loud gunshot through the grand living room. The sheer physical force of the impact snapped my head violently to the side. The stinging pain was immediate and blindingly hot, radiating across my left cheekbone and ringing loudly in my ear. I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the painted drywall hard to keep myself from collapsing completely to the polished floor. Gasps of sheer horror rippled through the upscale crowd. Someone dropped a crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending glittering shards flying across the Persian rug. Madison shrieked loudly, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. Brad stepped back quickly, putting immediate physical distance between himself and my father. Even in high society, physical violence was the ultimate uncrossable line. William had just exposed himself as a brutal, unhinged monster in front of the very people he desperately needed to impress. I stood frozen against the wall. The metallic taste of blood pooled in the corner of my mouth where my teeth had cut deeply into my inner lip. The left side of my face throbbed with a burning, radiating heat. I did not raise my hand to touch the injury right away. I simply breathed, staring at the floor as the shock of the assault reverberated through my body. Catherine broke the stunned, terrifying silence. She did not rush forward to comfort me. She did not admonish her husband for striking his own daughter across the face. Instead, she weaponized the chaos to finish the execution. "Get out!" Catherine screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical, shrill pitch. Get out of my house right now. You are a toxic infection. You come in here and spread your disgusting lies and ruin our beautiful holiday. You are no longer a part of this family. I never want to see your miserable face again. Get out and never return. I slowly turned my head back to look at them. I did not cry. My eyes were completely dry. I raised my hand and gently touched my burning cheek. My fingertips came away with a tiny bright smear of crimson blood from the corner of my lip. I looked at the blood on my fingers. Then I looked directly at William. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his fist still clenched tightly at his side. He looked absolutely terrified. He had let his rage override his logic, and he knew he could never take that violent public action back. He had crossed the point of no return. I lowered my hand. A slow, cold, predatory smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of submission. It was the smile of a woman who had just watched her enemies walk willingly into a steel trap and lock the heavy door behind themselves. They wanted to play the victims. They wanted to exile me from their kingdom. They had no idea I already owned the very ground they were standing on. You do not have to ask me twice. Mother, I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. I am leaving. Enjoy your Thanksgiving. Because it will absolutely be the last one you ever host in this city. I did not look at the shocked guests. I did not look at Madison. I did not look at Jamal, who was standing perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking my every movement with silent, intense solidarity. I simply turned my back on all of them. I walked down the grand hallway, my footsteps echoing with calm, measured precision. I grabbed my thin wool coat from the chair where Catherine had discarded it earlier. I pulled the heavy front door open, letting the freezing Chicago winter air rush into the overheated, toxic mansion. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut firmly behind me, cutting off the sounds of their panicking murmurs. The night air was brutally cold. The wind whipped across the expansive manicured lawn, biting through my thin coat and stinging my burning cheek. I walked down the long cobblestone driveway, my heels crunching against the thin layer of frost accumulating on the ground. I walked past Madison's brand new Porsche Panamera. I walked past the row of luxury vehicles belonging to the guests who had just watched my father assault me. I reached my rusted 10-year-old sedan parked in the dark shadows near the main gate. My hands were shaking slightly as I pulled my keys from my pocket. It was not from fear or sadness. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. The plan was officially in motion. The war had begun. I unlocked the car door and slid into the freezing driver's seat. I shoved the key into the ignition and twisted it. The old engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, the heater blowing cold air directly into my face. I reached for the gear shift, ready to put the car in drive and leave this toxic compound forever. Suddenly, the passenger side door handle clicked. The heavy metal door swung open, pulling a sharp gust of freezing wind into the cabin. I flinched, turning sharply, expecting to see William coming out to finish what he started, or Catherine coming to hurl more aggressive threats. It was not my parents. Jamal slid into the passenger seat, pulling the door shut firmly behind him. He was still wearing his tailored charcoal suit, but he had removed his tie. The dome light of the car illuminated his face. His expression was completely focused, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not offer empty apologies for my family's behavior. He knew we were far past the point of polite comfort. Jamal reached into his suit jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. The metal gleamed brightly in the dim light of the car cabin. He held it out, extending his hand across the center console toward me. You were right about the books, Jamal said, his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet space of my battered car. You were right about all of it. The shell companies, the fake vendor payouts, the embezzled pension funds. I bypassed William's home network security. I downloaded the entire raw, unfiltered financial ledger of Apex Distribution. It is all right here. Every single fraudulent transaction they have made for the last decade. I stared at the silver flash drive resting in his palm. The ultimate weapon. the final piece of the puzzle I needed to completely decimate my parents' corporate empire and send them straight to federal prison. I slowly reached out and took the flash drive from his hand. My fingers closed tightly around the cold metal. Jamal looked out the windshield toward the massive glowing mansion in the distance. "Put the car in drive," Rachel Jamal instructed, leaning back against the worn fabric of the passenger seat. "Let us go get a coffee. We have a lot of accounting to do." I shifted the car into drive and pressed my foot hard on the accelerator. The tires spun briefly on the icy cobblestones before catching traction. We sped out of the massive wrought iron gates, leaving the glowing toxic mansion far behind us. The drive into the city was entirely silent. The adrenaline from the confrontation was slowly bleeding out of my system, leaving a cold, throbbing ache across my left cheek, where my father had struck me. We found a 24-hour diner nestled under the rusty tracks of the elevated train line. It was a gritty, neon-lit sanctuary, completely empty, except for a tired waitress wiping down the formica counter. The smell of burnt coffee and harsh industrial bleach filled the air. It was the exact opposite of the luxurious catered dining room we had just fled, and it felt infinitely safer. We slid into a cracked red vinyl booth in the back corner. Jamal ordered a black coffee. I ordered the same. I placed my laptop on the sticky table. Jamal looked at the harsh fluorescent light reflecting off my bruised cheek. "I should have stepped in," Jamal said, his voice heavy with quiet, controlled anger. "I should have broken his jaw the second he raised his hand to you." "No," I said firmly, opening the lid of my laptop. "If you had touched him, they would have called the police. You would have been arrested for assaulting a billionaire in his own home. You did exactly what you needed to do. You secured the data." Jamal took a slow sip of his coffee. "I spent 5 years ignoring the microaggressions, Rachel. I sat at that mahogany table and let William belittle my background. I let Catherine make her subtle racist comments about my upbringing on the South Side. I tolerated it because I loved Madison. I genuinely believed she was different from them. I believed she was just trapped in their orbit." "The golden child is never trapped," I said, my voice flat. "They are the designated heir to the corruption." Jamal nodded, his dark eyes hardening. "Tonight, William told me to remember my place. He called me a low-level paper pusher." And Madison smiled. She defended him. She looked at me like I was a disposable asset. That was my absolute breaking point. "Welcome to the outside," I said, typing in my laptop password. 2 years ago, I was the lead internal auditor. I was running a basic variance analysis on the operational budget. I noticed a massive discrepancy in the employee pension fund. William and Catherine were aggressively skimming the retirement accounts of their oldest warehouse workers. They were funneling the cash to pay for Madison's extravagant trips to Europe and her custom jewelry. When I brought the spreadsheets to them, I expected them to be horrified by the accounting error. Instead, they looked at me with pure disgust. I paused, feeling the familiar burn of betrayal in my chest. "They locked me out of the building that night," I continued. "They wiped my hard drive and fabricated a wire transfer using my administrative credentials. They framed me for stealing $250,000. They told me if I went to the authorities, they would hand the fake evidence to the police. They destroyed my career to protect Madison's shopping habits." Jamal reached into his suit jacket and placed the silver flash drive on the table next to my laptop. "They made a catastrophic miscalculation," Jamal said. "They framed a top-tier supply chain auditor, and they alienated a federal tax attorney. You know the internal operational mechanisms of Apex Distribution. You know exactly how the supply chain is supposed to function and where the logistical bleeding occurs. I know the federal tax code. I know exactly how the IRS tracks offshore asset sheltering and corporate embezzlement. Together we can dismantle this entire empire. Let us get to work," I said. I plugged the silver flash drive into the USB port. A notification popped up on the screen. The drive was loaded with hundreds of gigabytes of raw, unencrypted data. Jamal had completely bypassed William's lazy security protocols and copied the master directory of the Home Office network. I opened the primary financial ledger for the current fiscal year. My eyes scanned the columns of data. As a trained auditor, I did not need a calculator to spot the glaring catastrophic anomalies. The numbers told a horrifying story. Look at this, I said, pointing at the screen. These are the vendor payout logs. Apex Distribution is paying millions of dollars to a logistics firm called Horizon Logistics. But I know for a fact Apex uses an entirely different fleet for their Midwest distribution route. Horizon Logistics does not exist. It is a phantom vendor. Jamal leaned closer to the screen, his eyes tracking the routing numbers attached to the phantom payouts. Copy that routing number and cross-reference it with the banking directory, Jamal instructed. I ran the search. The results populated instantly. The routing number did not belong to a domestic commercial bank. It belonged to an offshore financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. They are not just skimming the pension funds anymore, Jamal said, his voice dropping to a stunned whisper. This is a massive coordinated tax evasion syndicate. William and Catherine are intentionally defaulting on their domestic commercial lease. They are intentionally missing legitimate vendor payments. They are reporting massive operational losses to the IRS to avoid paying corporate taxes. But in reality, they are bleeding all the liquid cash out of Apex Distribution and funneling it into untraceable offshore accounts. I clicked through another folder, pulling up the tax returns from the previous 3 years. They have siphoned at least $12 million into the Cayman accounts, I said, my heart pounding, as the sheer scale of the felony unfolded on the screen. They are bankrupting the company on paper while hoarding the actual cash overseas. They plan to let Apex Distribution collapse under the weight of its own debt, leaving the employees with absolutely nothing. And Madison is the chief financial officer, Jamal said, his jaw clenching. Her signature is on every single one of these fraudulent federal tax returns. She is actively authorizing the transfer of stolen funds to the Cayman Islands. She bought that $120,000 Porsche using the very same corporate credit lines they are claiming are maxed out. We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of the crime. William and Catherine were not just greedy business owners, they were sophisticated criminals running a highly illegal offshore sheltering operation. They had destroyed my life to protect a $12 million tax fraud conspiracy. I continued scrolling through the master directory, clicking past the offshore banking records and the fake operational invoices. Near the very bottom of the directory tree, I noticed a strangely named subfolder. It was hidden inside a redundant file path, clearly designed to be overlooked by a casual glance. What is this? I asked, highlighting the folder. The folder was labeled Liability Mitigation. Open it, Jamal said, his tone suddenly shifting from analytical to deeply concerned. In corporate law, liability mitigation usually refers to insurance policies or legal defense strategies. But William does not use standard legal terminology unless he is hiding something highly sensitive. I double-clicked the folder. Inside were several high-resolution scanned PDF documents. I opened the first file. It was a formal legal contract bearing the official letterhead of Apex Distribution. As I read the text of the contract, my blood ran entirely cold. Jamal. I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. Look at this. Jamal leaned forward, his eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. The document was a binding fiduciary appointment contract. It explicitly named the designated individual as the primary legal consultant responsible for all offshore tax strategy and corporate fund routing for Apex Distribution. It was a legally binding document designed to shift 100% of the criminal liability for the Cayman Island accounts onto a single external consultant. I scrolled down to the signature line at the very bottom of the page. There was a signature written in crisp blue ink. Next to the signature was a date stamp from 6 months ago. Jamal stared at the screen. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking physically ill. He reached out and touched the laptop screen, his finger tracing the signature. "That is my signature," Jamal said, his voice cracking with absolute horrified realization. I looked at the document again, comparing the strokes of the pen. "Did you sign this, Jamal?" "No," Jamal said, breathing heavily, his dark eyes wide with shock. "I have never seen this document in my entire life. I have never provided formal fiduciary consulting for Apex Distribution. I deliberately kept my legal practice completely separate from their business." I opened the next PDF file in the folder. It was an email chain between William and Madison. The email was dated just a few days before the forged contract was supposedly signed. Madison sent William a copy of your signature from a joint tax return you filed last year. I said, reading the text of the email out loud. She told William it would be incredibly easy to digitally lift the signature and apply it to the fiduciary contracts. Jamal fell back against the red vinyl booth. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow. He stared blankly at the ceiling of the diner, trying to process the horrifying reality of what he was looking at. William and Catherine were not just evading taxes. They were not just hoarding millions of dollars in offshore accounts. They knew the IRS would eventually audit a company bleeding that much cash. They knew they needed a foolproof escape plan when the federal agents finally came knocking on the door of the mansion. They were not planning to take the fall. They were setting up a fall guy. They forged your signature, I said, closing the laptop screen slightly to protect the documents from prying eyes. They designated you as the mastermind behind the entire offshore tax evasion syndicate. If the IRS audits Apex Distribution, William and Catherine walk away clean. Madison walks away clean. Jamal looked at me, his eyes burning with a sudden terrifying intensity. They are planning to send me to federal prison, Jamal whispered. My own wife forged my signature to frame me for a $12 million federal crime. My own wife forged my signature to frame me for a $12 million federal crime. Jamal reached up with trembling fingers and slowly pulled his wire-framed glasses off his face. He set them down on the sticky vinyl table with meticulous care. He did not cry. He did not yell. He stared at the glowing laptop screen with a look of absolute terrifying rage. His large hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. The fluorescent lights of the diner buzzed overhead, casting long, harsh shadows across his face. For a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the strict adherence of federal law, the betrayal was absolute. Madison had not just cheated on him or lied to him about money. She had actively, maliciously planned to strip him of his freedom. She had signed off on a plan to send her own husband to a federal penitentiary just so she could keep driving a luxury sports car and taking month-long vacations to Europe. I watched him process the catastrophic reality. I knew exactly what that kind of betrayal felt like. 2 years ago, I had experienced that exact same earth-shattering realization when my parents framed me for embezzlement. Now Jamal was standing in the exact same blast radius. Do you know what the mandatory minimum sentence is for a $12 million offshore tax evasion conspiracy? Rachel Jamal asked, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper. I shook my head, remaining perfectly quiet to let him speak. It is 20 years in a federal penitentiary, Jamal stated, looking up at me with dark, burning eyes. 20 years. And they added aggravated corporate fraud and identity theft to the mix by forging my signature. William and Catherine knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the IRS would eventually audit a company bleeding this much operational cash. They needed a scapegoat with a legal background to make the fraud look like a sophisticated external consulting scheme. They chose me because I am a tax attorney. They thought my credentials would lend legitimacy to their fake offshore routing documents. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. They used your professional reputation to build their safety net, I said, realizing the true depth of their depravity. They invited you into this family just to use you as a human shield. And Madison helped them build it, Jamal said, his voice practically vibrating with raw anger. My wife sent them my signature. She smiled at me across the dinner table every single night, knowing she had signed my life away. She watched me tolerate her father's racist insults. She watched me swallow my pride to keep the peace in her family, and the entire time she was preparing to throw me to the federal prosecutors. He picked up his coffee cup, but his hand was shaking so violently that dark liquid sloshed over the rim and spilled onto the table. He slammed the mug down. I am not going to prison for them, Jamal declared, his tone shifting from shock to absolute deadly resolve. I am a black man in America, Rachel. If I walk into a federal courtroom facing $12 million in corporate fraud charges with a forged signature on the dotted line, I will never see the outside of a cell again. They will bury me. William knows that. He is counting on it. He is counting on the justice system to look at a wealthy billionaire patriarch and a working-class black attorney and automatically assign the guilt to me. He is underestimating you, I said, firmly closing the laptop screen just enough to dim the light. He is underestimating both of us. We are not victims, Jamal. We have the master directory. We have the raw, unencrypted data. We have the offshore routing numbers. We have the forged emails proving Madison supplied your signature. We hold every single piece of evidence required to put them away forever. Jamal put his glasses back on. The sharp, analytical focus returned to his eyes instantly. He was no longer a betrayed husband. He was a ruthless federal tax attorney preparing for war. You are absolutely right, Jamal said, pulling his encrypted smartphone from his jacket pocket. We are not going to wait for the IRS to audit them. We are going to hand-deliver the execution order ourselves. Have you ever heard of the IRS Whistleblower Reward Program, Rachel? I nodded, my professional background as an auditor kicking in. Form 211. It allows individuals who report massive tax evasion to receive a percentage of the recovered funds and grants them certain legal protections for providing the evidence. Exactly, Jamal said, tapping the screen of his phone rapidly. But I am not going to use a standard submission portal. I am a specialized tax attorney. I know the exact protocols, and I have direct contacts within the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. When fraud exceeds $2 million, the IRS fast-tracks the investigation. We are looking at a $12 million offshore syndicate. This is a Tier 1 felony case. He looked at me, his expression deadly serious. I am going to draft a formal whistleblower submission right now. I will attach the offshore routing numbers, the fake operational invoices, and the internal emails proving the forgery. I will request immediate federal immunity for myself in exchange for serving as their primary inside witness. Because I am a licensed officer of the court reporting an active felony conspiracy, they will grant the immunity immediately to secure the data. How fast will they move? I asked, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline. With this level of verified unencrypted evidence, Jamal stated firmly, they will not wait around. The Criminal Investigation Division does not send polite warning letters for offshore tax evasion of this magnitude. They send armed federal agents. They will freeze every single bank account associated with Apex distribution. They will freeze William and Catherine's personal assets. They will seize the mansion. They will impound Madison's new car. They will strip them of every single dollar they have ever stolen before the sun goes down. We sat in the diner booth for the next 2 hours, working in complete synchronized silence. We were a devastating team. I navigated the complex supply chain directories, extracting the exact dates and times William had authorized the phantom vendor payouts. Jamal drafted a flawless, airtight legal brief detailing the exact federal statutes the family had violated. We built a digital dossier so comprehensive and legally binding that no defense attorney in the country would be able to fight it. Jamal attached the encrypted files to a highly secure federal server portal. He reviewed the final submission one last time, his finger hovering over the screen of his phone. This will destroy her life, Jamal said quietly, looking at the digital file containing Madison's forged emails. She made her choice the moment she stole your signature, I reminded him, refusing to let him feel an ounce of guilt. She chose a luxury car over her husband's freedom. Jamal did not hesitate another second. He pressed his finger against the screen and submitted the files directly to the federal authorities. The confirmation message flashed brightly in the dim lighting of the diner. The strike was officially launched. The federal government now held the keys to the Apex distribution empire. We did it. I breathed, leaning back against the vinyl booth, feeling a massive weight lift from my chest. They are finished. Just as the words left my mouth, my cell phone buzzed loudly on the table. The sudden noise startled us both. I picked up the phone. It was an urgent email notification. I looked at the sender and my heart skipped a beat. It was an encrypted message from Jonathan Pierce. I opened the email quickly, my eyes scanning the brief, heavily coded text. Jonathan did not waste words. Rachel, Jonathan had written. Situation has escalated. William is panicking. He has found a buyer for the commercial land. The developers are bypassing standard due diligence to secure the zoning rights. William is attempting to illegally push through a fraudulent title transfer tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp. He wants to secure a $15 million cash payout before the banks realize he is insolvent. They are meeting in the main boardroom at Apex Distribution headquarters. Be ready. I stared at the screen, the sheer panic and greed of my father's plan echoing through the brief message. William knew his shell companies were collapsing. He knew the money was running out. He was trying to execute a desperate illegal real estate sale to secure $15 million in liquid cash so he could flee before the consequences caught up to him. He was planning to forge the property deed and sell land that rightfully belonged to my blind trust. "What is it?" Jamal asked, seeing the intense focus on my face. "William is trying to sell the commercial land tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, I said, turning the phone so Jamal could read the urgent message from the billionaire CEO. He is bringing the developers into the Apex boardroom to sign a fraudulent deed transfer. He wants $15 million in cash. Jamal looked at the message, his sharp legal mind instantly processing the timeline. If he signs a fraudulent deed transfer for $15 million that elevates his crimes from tax evasion to massive commercial real estate fraud and grand larceny, it is the final nail in his coffin. I closed my laptop and slid it into my bag. The exhaustion of the long night completely vanished, replaced by a burning, brilliant clarity. My parents had spent 2 years telling every employer in Chicago that I was a criminal. They had locked me out of my own career. They had slapped me across the face and thrown me out into the freezing winter night. They thought they had won. They thought they were untouchable. "We need to call your contacts at the IRS," I said, looking Jamal directly in the eyes. "Tell the federal agents to meet us at the Apex Distribution headquarters tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Jamal grabbed his coat, sliding out of the diner booth. A cold, predatory smile crossed his face. "I will tell them to bring the handcuffs," Jamal said. I left a $20 bill on the table for the tired waitress and walked out of the diner into the freezing Chicago morning. The sun was just starting to rise over the skyline, casting a brilliant golden light across the city. Tomorrow morning, William and Catherine were going to sit in their luxurious boardroom and attempt to steal $15 million. They were going to smile and shake hands with wealthy developers. And I was going to walk through those heavy oak doors and take absolutely everything away from them. The digital clock on the wall of the Apex Distribution boardroom flashed 9:45 in bright red numbers. The massive room was designed to project absolute corporate dominance. The table was carved from a single slab of imported marble. The leather chairs cost more than the average warehouse worker made in 6 months. But this morning the luxury felt like a suffocating trap. William stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the quiet loading docks below. He pulled at the collar of his custom-tailored suit, feeling a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. The warehouse was terrifyingly silent. The fleet of delivery trucks sat completely empty in the parking lot. The engines were cold. The drivers had not shown up for their morning shifts. They had not shown up because the payroll checks had bounced 48 hours ago. Apex Distribution was completely entirely out of cash. William turned away from the window and paced across the marble floor. His chest was tight with a suffocating panic he was desperately trying to hide. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands held $12 million, but that money was entirely frozen behind layers of illegal shell companies. He could not access a single dime without triggering a massive federal audit. His domestic accounts were overdrawn. The corporate credit lines were entirely maxed out from Madison buying her luxury sports car and Catherine funding her lavish holiday parties. If they did not secure $15 million in liquid cash today, the entire empire would collapse by tomorrow morning. The creditors would seize the building, the employees would riot, and the authorities would start looking very closely at the empty pension funds. Catherine sat at the edge of the marble table, nervously twisting her diamond wedding ring. She looked exhausted. The polished aristocratic facade she had weaponized at the Thanksgiving dinner had completely evaporated. "Are you sure they are coming, William?" she asked, her voice high and thin with anxiety. What if the developers backed out? What if they looked too closely at the zoning permits? "They are coming," William snapped, running a hand over his slicked back hair. They want this land, Catherine. They have already bought up the 3 adjacent lots. This headquarters is the final piece of the puzzle for their new tech campus. They are desperate to break ground before the winter freeze. They will not ask too many questions. Madison slouched in one of the executive leather chairs, scrolling through her phone with an air of profound, arrogant boredom. She was wearing a designer blazer and sipping a green smoothie completely detached from the catastrophic reality of their situation. Relax, Mom. Madison sighed, tossing her phone onto the marble table. You are sweating through your silk blouse. It is just a basic real estate transaction. We sign a few papers, we take the $15 million check, and we wire it to the offshore accounts to cover our tracks. It is literally that easy. William stopped pacing and glared at his youngest daughter. It is not a basic real estate transaction, Madison. We are selling commercial land that technically belongs to a blind trust managed by Pierce Global. We are actively forging a property deed. If Jonathan Pierce's legal division flags the title transfer before the check clears, we are all going to prison. Madison rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic scoff. She picked up a glossy silver pen and twirled it between her manicured fingers. You give Pierce Global way too much credit, Dad. Madison boasted, her tone dripping with sheer, unearned confidence. Jonathan Pierce is managing a $100 billion international logistics corporation. He does not care about a 30-acre lot in a suburban industrial park. He probably does not even know this blind trust exists. It is just a minor bureaucratic loophole buried in a mountain of corporate paperwork. She leaned forward, tapping the silver pen against the fraudulent contract resting in the center of the table. Do you know how easy it was to bypass their legal department? Madison continued, smiling smugly. I simply filed a quitclaim deed with the county clerk, asserting that Apex Distribution absorbed the trust assets during our last corporate restructuring. I ordered a replica of the Pierce Global corporate notary stamp online for $40. I stamped the release forms myself. The county clerk did not even blink. It is foolproof. Catherine let out a long, shaky breath, resting her hand over her heart. You are brilliant, Madison. I do not know what we would do without you as our chief financial officer. You have your father's exact mind for business. Thank goodness we got rid of Rachel when we did. She would have ruined this entire deal with her paranoid obsession over legal compliance. Rachel is a weak, cowardly loser, William sneered, feeling a sudden surge of aggressive bravado at the mention of my name. She proved that last night. She came into our home, tried to make a few empty threats, and the second I put her in her place, she ran out the door crying. She does not have the stomach for real corporate warfare. We are the ones who build empires. We take what we want. The heavy digital clock on the wall clicked to 9:55. A sharp knock on the boardroom doors made all 3 of them jump. William quickly straightened his tie, clearing his throat and forcing his face into a mask of absolute confident authority. Catherine sat up straight, pasting on her signature high society smile. Madison quickly closed out of her social media apps and opened a random financial spreadsheet on her laptop to look busy. Enter, William commanded, his voice booming with fake power. The receptionist opened the doors, stepping aside to let the buyers enter. A team of 5 men walked into the boardroom. Leading the pack was Mr. Thorne, a ruthless, highly successful commercial real estate developer. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and carried himself with the aggressive energy of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Behind him walked his lead legal counsel and 3 junior associates carrying heavy leather briefcases. William Thorne announced, striding across the room and extending his hand. Let us get this done. I have a demolition crew on standby, ready to tear this warehouse down the second the ink dries. William grasped Thorne's hand, shaking it firmly. We are ready when you are, Thorne. As we discussed, we need to expedite the final closing. We are looking to finalize the acquisition of our new facility across town by the end of the week. Thorne nodded, taking a seat across the marble table. His lawyers immediately opened their briefcases, pulling out thick stacks of legal contracts and property transfer agreements. I have the cashier's check for $15 million right here, Thorne said, pulling a crisp bank envelope from his breast pocket and placing it directly in the center of the table. It is fully authenticated and ready to be deposited into the Apex Distribution corporate account. But my legal team needs to review the final quitclaim deed and the release forms from the Pierce Global Blind Trust. We need to ensure the title is completely clear of any corporate liens before I hand over the cash. William felt a cold bead of sweat form at his temple. He swallowed hard, keeping his smile firmly in place. Of course, he said, gesturing toward Madison. My chief financial officer has all the documentation prepared and verified. Madison smiled brightly, sliding the fraudulent folder across the table to Thorne's lead attorney. Everything is in perfect order, gentlemen, she stated with absolute arrogant certainty. The blind trust was officially dissolved during our last quarter restructuring. The corporate stamps from Pierce Global are on page 4, verifying the immediate release of all property rights directly to Apex Distribution. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses, picking up the folder. The room went completely silent. The only sound was the ticking of the digital clock and the soft rustle of heavy paper as the lawyer flipped through the forged documents. William felt his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He watched the lawyer's eyes scan the fake corporate stamps. He watched him read the fraudulent signature Madison had boldly scrawled across the bottom line. If the lawyer noticed the inconsistencies in the font, if he noticed the stamp was slightly misaligned, if he demanded to call Pierce Global to verify the transaction, the entire illusion would shatter instantly. Catherine held her breath, clutching the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Madison simply sipped her green smoothie, utterly convinced of her own flawless genius. The lawyer reached page 4. He stared at the fake Pierce Global notary stamp for a long, agonizing moment. He ran his thumb over the ink. William felt the blood rushing in his ears. His entire life, his freedom, his mansion, his offshore accounts hung entirely in the balance of this single, terrifying second. The lawyer looked up from the document and turned to Thorne. The title is clear, the lawyer stated, closing the folder and sliding it back to the center of the table. The release forms are properly stamped and notarized by the parent trust. We are legally cleared to execute the purchase agreement. William let out a slow, silent breath, releasing the crushing tension from his lungs. A massive, euphoric wave of victory washed over him. They had done it. They had successfully bypassed the blind trust. They had fooled a team of top-tier commercial real estate lawyers. They were seconds away from securing $15 million in untraceable cash. Excellent, Thorne said, pulling the bank envelope forward. He slid the $15 million cashier's check out of the sleeve and placed it on top of the final purchase agreement. Let us sign the paperwork, William. You get your money, and I get my land. William reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his expensive gold-plated fountain pen. He looked at Catherine, who was now beaming with tears of sheer relief shining in her eyes. He looked at Madison, who offered him a smug, victorious wink. They had completely outsmarted the system. They were the masters of the corporate universe. They were completely untouchable. William leaned over the marble table, holding the heavy gold pen. He rested his left hand on the crisp paper of the purchase agreement, smoothing out the edges. He looked down at the signature line. This was the exact moment his salvation became permanent. He brought the golden tip of the pen down toward the paper, ready to sign his name and secure the $15 million that would save his entire fraudulent empire. The heavy oak double doors of the boardroom suddenly exploded open with a violent, deafening crash. The heavy oak double doors of the boardroom suddenly exploded open with a violent, deafening crash. The heavy brass handles slammed hard against the marble walls, sending a shockwave through the dead, silent room. William jumped back, his hand jerking away from the fraudulent purchase agreement. The expensive gold-plated fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the polished marble table. It rolled aimlessly, leaving a thin trail of dark black ink across the pristine white surface. I walked through the doorway. I was not wearing the cheap, thin wool coat from the night before. I was not the terrified, unemployed outcast who had been slapped and thrown into the freezing Chicago winter. I wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit like absolute armor. My posture was perfectly straight. My chin was high. The dark bruise on my left cheekbone, where my father had struck me, was still faintly visible beneath my makeup, but I wore it not as a badge of victimhood, but as a declaration of war. I was not alone. Flanking me on my right was Jonathan Pierce. The billionaire CEO of Pierce Global strode into the room with the terrifying, effortless authority of a man who owned entire city skylines. He wore a bespoke navy suit, his silver hair perfectly styled, his eyes scanning the boardroom with the clinical detachment of a predator assessing a trapped, desperate meal. Behind us walked a specialized tactical unit of corporate warfare. 4 senior litigators from the Pierce Global Executive Legal Division marched into the room in perfect synchronization. They carried heavy locked leather briefcases and wore expressions of absolute merciless intent. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, nobody in the boardroom moved a single muscle. The commercial developers sat frozen in their leather chairs. Thorne stared at Jonathan Pierce, his eyes wide with sudden profound confusion. Madison dropped her green smoothie. The plastic cup hit the marble table and tipped over, sending a thick pool of green liquid spilling directly toward the forged release documents. She scrambled frantically to pull the papers away, letting out a high-pitched gasp of panic. Catherine was the first to break the paralyzing silence. "Security." Catherine shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the glass windows. "Get corporate security up to the executive floor right this instant." She stood up so fast her heavy chair scraped violently against the floorboards. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with unhinged fury. "How dare you show your face in this building?" Catherine screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You are a convicted thief. You are a disgraced criminal. We trespassed you from this property 2 years ago. I want her arrested. Someone call the police and have this ungrateful wretch dragged out of here in handcuffs." The Pierce Global legal team did not even blink at her hysterical outburst. They simply fanned out, spreading across the back wall of the boardroom, effectively blocking the only exit. William finally found his voice. He grabbed the edge of the marble table, trying desperately to anchor himself to reality. He forced his face into a mask of aggressive corporate indignation, trying to salvage the rapidly disintegrating illusion of his authority. "Jonathan Pierce." William barked, projecting his voice from his chest to mask the terrified tremor underneath. "I demand to know the meaning of this unprecedented intrusion. This is a private, closed-door real estate transaction. You have absolutely no legal right to barge into my corporate headquarters. And I am utterly appalled that the CEO of a respected logistics empire would willingly associate with a blacklisted embezzler. That woman is a proven liability. She stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from this very company." William turned his desperate gaze toward Thorne and his legal team, trying to contain the massive catastrophic damage. "I sincerely apologize for this bizarre interruption, Mr. Thorne." William lied smoothly, plastering a fake apologetic smile onto his sweating face. "This is my estranged daughter. She has a documented history of severe mental instability and financial misconduct. She has been stalking our company ever since we rightfully terminated her. Security will have her removed immediately so we can finalize our lucrative partnership." Thorne did not smile back. The seasoned commercial real estate developer was not an idiot. He recognized the terrifying shift in the atmosphere. He looked at William's sweating forehead. He looked at the trembling hands of the Apex chief financial officer. Then he looked at the billionaire CEO standing calmly at the head of the table. Jonathan Pierce did not yell. He did not raise his voice to match William's frantic, aggressive tone. He simply walked slowly toward the center of the marble table. The sheer gravitational pull of his presence commanded absolute total silence. He placed his sleek black leather briefcase on the table right next to the $15 million cashier's check. The soft thud of the leather against the stone sounded like a judge's gavel striking a heavy wooden block. Jonathan unbuttoned his suit jacket and looked directly at the commercial developers. "Gentlemen," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerously quiet register. "I strongly advise you to pick up that cashier's check, put it back into your breast pocket, and put your checkbooks away immediately. The people sitting across from you do not have the legal authority to sign that purchase agreement. They are attempting to sell you stolen property." The words hit the boardroom like a targeted missile strike. Thorne's lead attorney gasped audibly. He instantly lunged forward, grabbing the bank envelope containing the $15 million check and snatching it protectively against his chest. His eyes darted rapidly between William and Jonathan Pierce. In commercial real estate, the mere accusation of a fraudulent title transfer from a billionaire CEO was enough to kill a deal permanently. "What the hell are you talking about?" Pierce Thorne demanded, standing up from his chair. His aggressive businessman persona flared up as he realized his massive tech campus project was suddenly in grave jeopardy. "We just reviewed the quitclaim deed. We reviewed the release forms from your own blind trust. The title is completely clear. The corporate stamps from your legal division are printed right there on page 4. Jonathan Pierce did not even look at the forged documents resting in front of Madison. He simply offered a cold, merciless smile. "My legal division did not stamp those forms," Jonathan stated with absolute certainty. "My legal division did not authorize a quitclaim deed. My legal division did not dissolve the blind trust. And they certainly did not release 30 acres of prime Chicago industrial real estate to a delinquent tenant who is currently 90 days past due on their commercial lease payments." Every single piece of paper sitting in front of William is a highly illegal fabricated forgery. Thorne turned his furious, intense glare directly onto William. The developer's face hardened into a mask of pure, ruthless anger. "You handed me forged title documents," Thorne roared, slamming his hand down on the marble table. "You tried to drag my development firm into a massive felony real estate scam. Are you completely out of your mind, William? If my compliance team had processed that fraudulent title, my entire firm would be facing federal indictment for money laundering." William was hyperventilating. The oxygen was rapidly leaving his lungs. His perfectly constructed $15 million escape hatch was actively burning to the ground right in front of his eyes. The desperation completely overrode his logic. He abandoned the fake aristocratic grace and resorted to pure aggressive posturing. "That is a blatant lie," William screamed, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger at Jonathan Pierce. "You are trying to sabotage my company. You are trying to bankrupt Apex Distribution so you can swoop in and acquire our logistical routes for pennies on the dollar. I will not let you destroy my legacy. I will sue Pierce Global for tortious interference. I will sue you for gross defamation of character. I will sue you for corporate sabotage. I will drag you through federal civil court until you beg for a settlement." Madison jumped up from her chair, her hands trembling violently as she clutched the edge of the marble table. She refused to accept that her brilliant, flawless plan was collapsing. Her arrogant entitlement blinded her to the massive legal freight train hurtling directly toward her. "You cannot stop this sale!" Madison shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the glass windows. "I filed the paperwork myself. The county clerk verified the corporate stamps. The local government officially recognized the dissolution of the blind trust. We own this land. You are just a bitter old man trying to bully us because we outsmarted your massive bureaucratic legal department. We have the verified ironclad quitclaim deed right here." Madison aggressively shoved the forged folder across the table toward Jonathan Pierce, as if the fake documents were an impenetrable magic shield. I did not wait for Jonathan to respond. It was my turn to deliver the execution. I stepped forward. I walked past the line of Pierce Global attorneys. I walked past Thorne and his panicking legal team. I walked right up to the very edge of the marble table, standing directly across from my hyperventilating father and my shrieking entitled sister. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to scream to command the room. I held absolute, ultimate power. I raised my right arm. In my hand, I held a thick, heavy black leather binder. The spine was stamped with a bright red, highly secure legal seal. It was the master portfolio of the original, irrevocable blind trust established 10 years ago by the true founder of this empire. I looked William dead in the eyes. I saw the sheer, unadulterated terror radiating from his pupils. I saw the devastating realization slowly creeping into his mind that he had severely, fatally underestimated the daughter he threw away. "You do not own this land, Dad," I said, my voice slicing through the chaotic shouting like a finely sharpened blade. I swung my arm down with all my strength. I slammed the heavy red-stamped legal binder onto the polished marble table. The massive binder crashed down directly on top of William's forged purchase agreement and Madison's fake Pierce Global stamps. The loud explosive impact made everyone in the room flinch. I kept my hand pressed firmly against the leather cover of the binder, leaning my weight forward. I stared into my father's terrified soul. And I am not leaving this boardroom until I take absolutely everything away from you. You do not own this building. You do not own the dirt beneath it. You never did. I delivered the words with a calm, icy precision that cut through the heavy air of the boardroom. I watched the absolute terror paralyze my father. His hands remained frozen in the air, hovering uselessly over the forged purchase agreement he had been seconds away from signing. The aggressive billionaire persona he had projected just moments ago completely evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, sweating shell of a man. "That is impossible," William stammered, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. He looked frantically at Jonathan Pierce and then back at the red-stamped binder under my hand. "My mother left me this entire enterprise. I have the corporate charters. I have the municipal tax records. I am the sole operational heir of Apex Distribution. You are bluffing. You fabricated a fake portfolio to disrupt my commercial transaction." I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice to match his panic. I simply opened the heavy leather cover of the binder. I flipped past the notarized title authentications and the federal tax compliance certificates. I found the original heavy parchment document sealed by my grandmother 10 years ago. I slid it out of the protective plastic sleeve and held it up for everyone in the room to see. The vintage corporate letterhead of Apex Distribution sat proudly at the top of the page. "This is the final irrevocable addendum to the last will and testament of Beatrice," I announced, projecting my voice so Thorne and his team of commercial real estate lawyers could hear every single devastating syllable. It was executed, registered, and locked into a high-security federal trust exactly 1 month before her death. I lowered my eyes to the paper and began to read my grandmother's final binding words aloud. "I, Beatrice, being of sound mind and absolute authority over the assets of Apex Distribution, do hereby execute a permanent legal severance of my estate. My son William is greedy, arrogant, and fundamentally lacking in basic corporate discipline. I know with absolute certainty that he will eventually drive the operational side of my company into total bankruptcy. To protect the foundational wealth of this family from his inevitable incompetence, I hereby sever all commercial real estate holdings from the operational business entity." William let out a choked, gasping sound. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished marble floor. He hit the edge of the floor-to-ceiling window and braced himself against the glass, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I continued reading, showing no mercy. "I hereby transfer 100% of the land, the warehouses, the zoning rights, and the physical infrastructure of the Apex Distribution headquarters into a highly secured blind trust. Jonathan Pierce will serve as the executive trustee. The sole absolute and unshielded beneficiary of this real estate portfolio is my granddaughter Rachel. William will inherit the operational business, but he will never own the ground he stands on. He will pay commercial rent to the trust for the rest of his miserable life." I placed the document back down onto the marble table right next to Madison's forged quitclaim deed. "For 10 long years, Dad," I said, looking directly into his horrified eyes, "you have been writing massive monthly rent checks to the property management division of Pierce Global. You thought you were paying a faceless corporate landlord. You thought you were just dealing with standard commercial overhead. You had absolutely no idea that every single dollar you paid in rent was being filtered through Jonathan Pierce's accounts and deposited directly into a compounding trust bearing my name." Catherine let out a sharp, trembling cry. She covered her mouth with both hands, her diamond rings flashing under the boardroom lights. The reality of the situation was crashing down upon her. The daughter she had starved, the daughter she had blacklisted, the daughter she had thrown out into the freezing Chicago winter was actually the billionaire landlord of their entire failing empire. But my grandmother's brilliant financial trap was only the first half of the execution. I was not finished. I turned my attention to the stack of bright red delinquency notices sitting inside my binder. I pulled them out and tossed them casually onto the marble table, letting them scatter across William's fraudulent contracts. "That brings us to your current catastrophic liquidity crisis," I stated, crossing my arms over my tailored suit. "You drained your operational budget to buy Madison a $120,000 Porsche. You drained your reserves to fund luxury vacations and high society holiday parties. Because of your reckless, unchecked greed, Apex Distribution is currently 90 days past due on its commercial lease." I looked at Thorne, the commercial developer, who was watching the scene unfold with a mixture of profound shock and rising fury. "They are in default of their master lease agreement, Mr. Thorne," I explained, shifting my gaze back to my sweating father. "As the legal owner of this property, I am officially initiating the eviction process. You have absolutely no legal standing to sell this land. You have no legal right to execute a title transfer. In fact, as of 9 o'clock this morning, you no longer have a legal right to occupy these premises. You are trespassing on my property." The atmosphere in the boardroom instantly violently shifted. The commercial developers, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly snapped into aggressive defensive action. Thorne, a man whose entire reputation was built on ruthless efficiency, realized how incredibly close he had come to stepping into a massive federal fraud trap. Thorne stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He reached across the marble table and aggressively snatched the bank envelope containing the $15 million cashier's check. He shoved it deep into his breast pocket, securing his funds. "Pack it up!" Thorne barked at his legal team, his voice echoing with absolute furious authority. "Pack every single document up right now. Do not leave a single pen behind." His lawyers scrambled, moving with panicked speed. They shoved the purchase agreements, the title transfers, and their legal notepads into their heavy leather briefcases, snapping the brass locks shut with loud, definitive clicks. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with this radioactive crime scene. Thorne turned his full, towering presence toward William. The commercial developer looked at my father with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust that made William physically shrink against the window. "You pathetic, arrogant fraud!" Thorne snarled, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "You sat in my office last week and shook my hand. You looked me in the eye and guaranteed a clean title. You brought my top-tier legal team into this building and handed them forged documents. You tried to use my development firm to launder $15 million in stolen real estate." William raised his hands in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Thorne, please, you have to listen to me," William begged, his voice cracking pathetically. "We can fix this. I can negotiate with Pierce Global. I can get the title cleared. Just give me 48 hours to restructure the deal." "I will give you absolutely nothing," Thorne roared, stepping aggressively toward William. "If my compliance team had processed that fake quitclaim deed, my entire firm would be facing federal indictment for commercial fraud and money laundering. You tried to destroy my company to cover your own bankrupt failures." Thorne adjusted his suit jacket, his eyes burning with absolute contempt. "My lawyers are keeping digital copies of the forged documents you presented today," Thorne stated coldly. "We are handing them directly to the state prosecutor to clear our own liability. You are completely finished in this city, William. I will personally make sure every commercial investor in Chicago knows exactly what you tried to pull here today. You will never secure a single business loan again." Thorne did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel and marched out of the boardroom, his legal team trailing quickly behind him. They bypassed Jonathan Pierce and the corporate security detail, walking out the heavy oak doors without looking back. The $15 million lifeline my parents had been desperately counting on walked right out the door with them, completely vanishing forever. The boardroom plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. The reality of their absolute total destruction finally shattered the last remaining pieces of my family's delusion. The money was gone. The land was mine. The state prosecutors were about to receive evidence of their real estate forgery. They had lost everything in the span of 5 agonizing minutes. Madison suddenly snapped. The golden child, the entitled chief financial officer who had never faced a single consequence in her entire pampered life, completely lost her mind. She could not process the fact that her luxury lifestyle, her designer clothes, and her expensive cars were vanishing into thin air. "It is a fake!" Madison screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical, ear-piercing pitch. She jumped up from her leather chair, her face contorted into a mask of pure, feral rage. She pointed a shaking finger at the red-stamped binder resting on the table. She fabricated the trust documents. She paid Jonathan Pierce to lie for her. She is a convicted thief trying to steal our money. Madison lunged across the wide marble table. She scrambled over the polished surface, knocking over water glasses and scattering the forged contracts. Her hands clawed aggressively toward my face, her manicured fingernails aimed directly at my eyes. She wanted to physically tear the legal documents away from me. She wanted to destroy the evidence of her own failure. I did not even flinch. I stood perfectly still. Before Madison could reach the center of the table, Jonathan Pierce's corporate security detail moved with terrifying military precision. Two large men in dark suits stepped seamlessly in front of me, forming an impenetrable human wall. One of the security agents reached out and caught Madison by the shoulders, stopping her frantic forward momentum instantly. He shoved her backward with effortless, calculated force. Madison tumbled off the marble table, landing hard on the floorboards with a heavy, painful thud. Her designer blazer twisted awkwardly around her shoulders. She scrambled backward, hitting the base of the conference table, her breath coming in ragged, hysterical gasps. "Do not touch her!" Catherine shrieked, scrambling toward her youngest daughter. But as Catherine dropped to the floor to help Madison up, something entirely unexpected happened. The wealthy aristocratic matriarch, who had spent 2 years hunting me down, who had called me a toxic infection, who had ordered me out of her mansion just the night before, looked up at me from the hardwood floor. She saw the impenetrable wall of corporate lawyers. She saw the billionaire CEO standing firmly by my side. She saw the absolute cold, unyielding power radiating from my posture. Catherine realized with terrifying clarity that her aggressive threats and manipulative screams would no longer work. The power dynamic had permanently, completely reversed. Catherine's entire demeanor shifted in a fraction of a second. The arrogant, vicious monster vanished, replaced by a pathetic, groveling beggar. She crawled forward on her knees, her heavy silk skirt pooling around her legs. She reached her shaking hands out toward me, tears streaming down her carefully makeup-covered face. They were not tears of anger. They were tears of absolute, desperate terror. "Rachel, please." Catherine sobbed, her voice cracking pathetically as she knelt on the floor before me. "Please, you cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We raised you. We are your flesh and blood." She looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "You cannot evict us from this building," Catherine begged openly, weeping in front of the silent security guards. "If you lock the doors, we will lose everything. The creditors will seize the house. We will be bankrupt. We will be out on the street. Please, Rachel, I am begging you. Show some mercy. We are your family." I looked down at my mother kneeling on the floor of the boardroom she used to rule. I looked at my father cowering against the window, shivering in his custom suit. I looked at Madison crying hysterically against the base of the table. They wanted mercy. They wanted family loyalty. They wanted the very things they had violently stripped away from me when I was freezing and starving in a run-down apartment. I opened my mouth to deliver my final absolute rejection. I was ready to tell them to pack their boxes and get off my property. But before I could speak, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open one more time. My execution was only the first wave. The second, far more devastating strike had just arrived to finish the job. I looked down at my mother kneeling on the floor. Her tears were completely fake, manufactured in a desperate attempt to save her lavish lifestyle. She expected me to crumble. She expected the deep conditioned loyalty of a daughter to override the cold, hard facts of her absolute betrayal. I did not move a single inch. I looked at her with eyes like solid ice. "I am not just evicting you," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper that carried across the entire silent boardroom. "I am burying you." The heavy oak doors swung open wide. The security guards who had been blocking the exit stepped aside, smoothly clearing the path. Jamal walked into the boardroom. He was no longer the quiet, submissive son-in-law who stood in the shadows at family dinners. He was no longer the man who swallowed racist insults to keep the peace. He walked with the terrifying, authoritative presence of a federal prosecutor stepping into a courtroom he absolutely controlled. His tailored charcoal suit looked like armor. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of mercy. But Jamal did not walk into the room alone. He was flanked by 4 individuals wearing tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow letters printed across their chests read IRSCID. The Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, had officially arrived. These were not civil auditors carrying calculators and spreadsheets. These were armed federal agents who specialized in dismantling massive offshore tax evasion syndicates and executing high-level corporate raids. They moved with absolute military precision, securing the perimeter of the boardroom instantly. The air in the room completely vanished. William slumped against the glass window, his legs finally giving out. He slid down the glass and hit the floor, staring at the federal agents with a look of pure, hollow devastation. He knew exactly what those yellow letters meant. His $12 million Cayman Islands safety net had just been discovered. The illusion was entirely over. Madison, however, was still completely blinded by her own delusional entitlement. The golden child simply could not comprehend that her actions had real terrifying consequences. She scrambled up from the floor, brushing the dirt off her designer blazer. When she saw Jamal standing in the doorway, her panicked face suddenly lit up with profound, arrogant relief. She genuinely believed her husband was there to rescue her. She believed the brilliant tax attorney had arrived to bail her out of the catastrophic mess she had created. "Jamal," she screamed, running across the marble floor toward him. "Thank God you are here. Do you see what is happening? Rachel fabricated some insane legal documents to steal our land, and now these people are trying to harass us. You have to fix this. Use your legal contacts, file an injunction, make them leave my building right now." She reached out to grab his arm, expecting him to pull her into a protective embrace. Jamal stepped back abruptly. He looked at her outstretched hands with absolute profound disgust, as if she were covered in a toxic radioactive substance. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. The sheer, deadly calm of his demeanor was far more terrifying than any aggressive outburst could ever be. "Do not touch me, Madison," Jamal stated, his voice echoing harshly off the boardroom walls. Madison froze, her hands hovering awkwardly in the air. Her eyes darted from Jamal to the grim-faced federal agent standing right behind him. The arrogant relief began to drain from her face, replaced by a sudden creeping terror. "What are you talking about?" Madison stammered, her voice pitching higher. "I am your wife. You are a corporate tax lawyer. You have to protect me. Tell these agents they have no jurisdiction here. Tell them we have a team of accountants who handle our filings." Jamal reached his left hand into his suit jacket pocket. He did not pull out a legal brief or a defense strategy. He slowly pulled his hand back out and closed his fist. He stepped forward, walking past his panicking wife, and approached the massive marble conference table. The entire room watched in dead silence as Jamal raised his hand over the polished stone surface. He opened his fingers. A heavy platinum wedding band dropped from his palm. The ring hit the marble table with a sharp, definitive clink. The metallic sound echoed through the massive boardroom like a final damning verdict. It bounced once, rolled in a tight circle, and finally settled perfectly flat right next to William's discarded gold fountain pen. Madison let out a sharp, trembling gasp. She stared at the platinum ring resting on the marble table, her mind utterly failing to process the reality of the situation. "You forged my signature," Madison Jamal said, his deep voice cutting through her panic with surgical precision. "You sat in your father's private study and you digitally copied my signature from our joint marital tax return. You applied it to a binding fiduciary appointment contract. You officially designated me as the primary legal consultant responsible for all offshore tax strategy and corporate fund routing for Apex Distribution." William let out a miserable groaning sound from his spot on the floor. Catherine buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly. They knew they had been caught. They knew the paper trail was absolutely undeniable. You plan to use my professional credentials to legitimize your fraudulent $12 million tax evasion syndicate? Jamal continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward his wife. You knew the IRS would eventually audit a company bleeding this much operational cash. You needed a highly qualified scapegoat to take the fall when the federal investigators finally started looking at the missing pension funds. You planned to hand those forged contracts to the authorities and send your own husband to a federal penitentiary for 20 years, just so you could keep driving your $120,000 sports car. I did not know what those papers meant, Madison shrieked, stepping backward until her back hit the wall. She was openly weeping now, her mascara running down her cheeks. Dad told me it was just standard compliance paperwork. He said it was just a bureaucratic formality. I never meant to hurt you, Jamal. You have to believe me. I am your wife. I love you. You do not love anyone, Madison. Jamal stated, his expression remaining entirely cold. You love luxury cars. You love designer clothes. You love the fake status your parents bought for you with stolen money. Last night I stood in your hallway and listened to your father call me a low-level paper pusher. I listened to him mock my background. I listened to him disrespect my entire existence. And you smiled. You told me to remember my place. You told me to stop complaining and go get a drink. Jamal shook his head, a look of absolute finality settling over his sharp features. You told me to remember my place, Jamal repeated softly. So I did. I remembered that I am an officer of the court. I remembered that I am a highly trained federal tax attorney who knows exactly how to track illegal offshore wire transfers. I remembered that I have direct contacts within the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Madison's knees buckled slightly. She grabbed the edge of the nearest leather chair to keep herself from collapsing to the floor. The full, devastating weight of what her husband had done was finally crashing down upon her. I left your lavish holiday party, Madison Jamal said, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. I went straight to the federal authorities. As a licensed attorney reporting an active Tier 1 felony conspiracy, I utilized the IRS Whistleblower Reward Program. I handed over every single encrypted financial file from your father's unsecured home network. I handed over the fake operational invoices, the offshore routing numbers to the Cayman Islands, and the internal emails proving you explicitly planned to forge my signature. The lead IRS agent stepped forward, his hand resting casually near his utility belt. He looked at William and Catherine on the floor and then turned his stern gaze toward Madison. We have already secured federal warrants for every single asset attached to this corporation, the agent stated, his voice loud and authoritative. As of 8 o'clock this morning, all domestic and international bank accounts associated with Apex Distribution have been completely frozen. Your personal accounts have been frozen. Your residential estate is currently being cordoned off by federal authorities. You have absolutely zero access to any liquid capital. The financial infrastructure of the syndicate has been totally dismantled. Catherine let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She clawed at the polished marble floor, her perfectly manicured nails scraping against the stone. She realized her mansion, her jewelry, her country club memberships, and her entire high society identity had literally vanished into thin air. She was completely penniless. Jamal reached into his suit jacket one final time. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and held it out toward Madison. Madison stared at the envelope, her entire body shaking violently. She did not want to take it. She knew exactly what it was. Her perfect, wealthy, arrogant life had been entirely systematically destroyed in less than 24 hours. Take it, Jamal ordered, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Madison slowly raised her trembling hand and took the manila envelope from his grasp. She clutched it against her chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Those are your divorce papers, Jamal said, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. I have already filed them with the county clerk. I am officially severing all legal and financial ties to you and this entirely corrupt family. I have secured full federal immunity for my cooperation in this investigation. You, however, do not have immunity. You are the chief financial officer of a company that just committed massive federal tax fraud and grand larceny. Your signature is on the fraudulent tax returns. Your signature is on the embezzled pension fund transfers. Jamal looked at her one last time, all the warmth, all the love, all the loyalty completely drained from his eyes. Have fun in federal prison, CFO, Jamal said. FO. He turned his back on her and walked away from the terrified, sobbing wreck of the woman he used to love. He walked over to where I was standing next to Jonathan Pierce. Jamal gave me a single firm nod of solidarity. The alliance we had forged in that dark, greasy diner the night before had worked perfectly. We had executed a flawless, synchronized strike against the people who had tried to destroy us. The federal agents moved forward decisively. The lead agent pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The metallic rattling sound filled the boardroom, drowning out Catherine's pathetic wailing and William's defeated groans. William, Catherine, and Madison, the agent, announced, pulling out a thick stack of federal arrest warrants. You are hereby under arrest for conspiracy to commit tax evasion, corporate fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The agents hauled William up from the floor, yanking his arms behind his back. The billionaire patriarch did not fight back. He did not scream. He simply let the agents secure the steel cuffs around his wrists, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. He was completely, utterly broken. Catherine fought the agents, kicking and screaming as they pulled her up from the marble floor. She shrieked about her social standing, demanding they let her go, threatening to call the mayor. The agents ignored her hysterical threats, expertly securing her wrists and pushing her toward the heavy oak doors. Madison just stood there, clutching the manila envelope containing her divorce papers. She let the federal agent turn her around and place the handcuffs on her wrists. The shiny metal locked securely right next to her expensive diamond bracelet. The reality of her situation had finally broken her arrogant delusion. The golden child was going to a federal penitentiary. I stood in the center of the boardroom watching the federal agents march my family out the doors. I felt absolutely nothing for them. The deep, painful wounds they had inflicted on me over the years, the blacklisting, the starvation, the physical assault were finally completely healed. I had taken back my life. I had taken back my power. I had buried them. And the best part was that I was just getting started. The federal agents did not treat my family with the gentle, aristocratic respect they were accustomed to receiving. When Madison tried to pull away, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, the female IRS agent stepped in with swift, uncompromising authority. The agent grabbed the expensive leather handle and yanked the bag out of Madison's desperate grip. The bag was immediately dropped into a heavy plastic evidence sack and sealed with a bright red federal tag. Madison broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Her knees buckled under the weight of her reality. She was no longer a wealthy corporate executive. She was a federal suspect being stripped of her stolen armor. William watched his golden child collapse. The sight finally shattered the last remaining fragment of his ego. He turned his head, looking back over his shoulder as the agent shoved him toward the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. His eyes locked onto mine. The arrogance, the booming voice, the billionaire facade were entirely gone. He was nothing but a terrified old man facing the absolute ruin he had created. "Rachel, please." William begged, his voice cracking as he strained against the steel handcuffs. "You have to stop this. You are my daughter. You can talk to Pierce. You can talk to the authorities. Tell them we can make a deal. We can give you the operational business. We can give you everything. Just call them off, Rachel. Please do not let them do this to your own family." I stood beside Jonathan Pierce, my posture perfectly rigid, my expression carved from solid ice. I looked at the man who had slapped me across the face less than 12 hours ago. I looked at the man who had actively hunted down my job applications and starved me to protect his own greed. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I made sure my voice was loud enough for every single person in the boardroom to hear. "To whom it may concern," I stated, quoting the exact email he had used to destroy my life. "My parents are thieves. Do not hire them." William let out a wretched, sobbing gasp. It was the sound of total, ultimate defeat. The federal agents pushed him forward, forcing him out of the boardroom and down the long corridor. Catherine followed behind him, wailing hysterically about her ruined reputation. Madison trailed at the back, clutching her empty, handcuffed wrists. The heavy boardroom doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fate and silencing their pathetic cries forever. 1 month later, the toxic empire of Apex Distribution was completely officially eradicated from the Chicago Business Registry. The speed of the federal investigation was breathtaking. Armed with Jamal's immaculate, unencrypted data, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division froze every single domestic and offshore account tied to the family. The sprawling suburban mansion in Oak Brook was seized by the federal government. The luxury cars were impounded and auctioned off to pay the massive restitution fines. William, Catherine, and Madison were denied bail due to the severe flight risk posed by their Cayman Island connections. They sat in federal holding cells awaiting a trial they had absolutely no hope of winning. With the operational entity completely bankrupt and seized by federal authorities, I finally took total unshielded control of my inheritance. The 30 acres of prime commercial real estate belonged exclusively to me. I did not sell the land to the commercial developers. I did not take a quick cash payout. I had a much larger, much more ambitious vision. I utilized the massive capital reserves sitting inside my blind trust to completely renovate and modernize the warehouses. I stripped away the outdated, failing infrastructure my father had neglected for years. In its place, I built a state-of-the-art, highly automated supply chain hub. I founded my own independent corporation, naming it Vanguard Logistics. I was no longer just an internal auditor or a mid-level analyst begging for an interview. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. Jonathan Pierce did not just serve as my former trustee. He became my most powerful strategic partner. Pierce Global possessed a massive international shipping network, but they needed a modernized, centralized distribution hub in the Midwest to streamline their ground operations. Vanguard Logistics provided the exact infrastructure they required. We executed an exclusive, highly lucrative partnership agreement. I integrated my newly renovated warehouses directly into the Pierce Global supply chain network. The merger of our assets instantly elevated my new firm into the top tier of the Chicago logistics industry. My revenue projections for the first quarter alone surpassed what my father had managed to generate in 5 years. I stood in my new executive suite on the top floor of the newly rebranded Vanguard Logistics headquarters. The office was designed to my exact specifications: sleek, modern glass walls, minimal metallic accents, and a massive mahogany desk that commanded the room. It was a space built on competence and integrity, not inherited arrogance. A soft knock sounded at the glass door. Jamal walked into my office. He looked completely different from the quiet, suppressed man I had known for the past 2 years. He wore a sharp, tailored navy blue suit, but the heavy, suffocating tension he always carried around my family was entirely gone. His posture was relaxed, confident, and powerful. The heavy federal investigation had moved swiftly on his personal matters as well. With the undeniable proof of Madison's forgery and his status as a protected federal whistleblower, the courts had expedited his legal separation. The divorce was finalized this morning, Jamal announced, offering a genuine bright smile as he walked toward my desk. The judge granted the absolute dissolution. I am officially, completely free of them. I smiled back, feeling a profound sense of shared victory. Congratulations, Jamal. That is the best news I have heard all day. He took a seat in the leather chair across from my desk. The federal prosecutors offered me a very lucrative position in their financial crimes division, Jamal said, leaning back comfortably. They were highly impressed with the digital dossier we built. They said it was the most comprehensive, airtight evidence package they had seen in a decade. I raised an eyebrow, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my desk. And did you accept their offer? Jamal let out a low, rich laugh. I told them I already had a much better offer on the table. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a thick, crisp legal contract. I slid it across the smooth surface toward him. The document was a formal executive employment agreement. Vanguard Logistics needs a chief compliance officer. I stated, my tone shifting into a professional but warm register. We are handling massive operational contracts for Pierce Global. We are routing millions of dollars in international supply chain assets. I need someone who knows the federal tax code inside and out. I need someone whose integrity is absolutely bulletproof. I need someone I can trust with my life. Jamal picked up the contract. He read the title and the compensation package. His eyes widened slightly at the generous equity stake I had included in the offer. He looked up at me, his dark eyes filled with profound mutual respect. You and I dismantled a corrupt empire in 24 hours from a dirty booth in a roadside diner. Jamal said, his voice steady and full of conviction. Imagine what we can build with a multi-million-dollar infrastructure and absolute legal authority. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a silver pen, and signed his name on the bottom line with a sharp, decisive stroke. I stood up and walked over to a small crystal decanter resting on a side table. I poured 2 glasses of premium aged bourbon and walked back, handing one to my new chief compliance officer. Jamal stood up, taking the glass. We raised our drinks, holding them up in the bright morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. To Vanguard Logistics, Jamal said. To Chosen Family, I replied. We clinked our glasses together, the clear, sharp sound ringing beautifully in the spacious office. We took a sip, letting the smooth warmth of the bourbon seal our new, unbreakable alliance. A week later, I was standing by the massive glass windows of my corner office. I was looking out over the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline. The city that had once felt like a frozen, hostile prison now felt like my personal kingdom. My name was no longer a toxic liability. It was a highly respected brand. The business world moves fast, but gossip moves faster. Forbes magazine had just published a massive feature article detailing the catastrophic collapse of Apex Distribution and the subsequent rapid rise of Vanguard Logistics. The article highlighted my strategic partnership with Jonathan Pierce and my transition from a blacklisted auditor to a logistics titan. My face was printed across a full-page spread, looking powerful, unbothered, and victorious. The sleek black phone on my desk began to ring. I walked over and picked up the receiver. Vanguard Logistics. Rachel speaking. I answered, my voice smooth and professional. Rachel. Oh, thank goodness I finally got through to your direct line, a panicked, breathless voice said on the other end. This is Thomas Bradley. I am the senior hiring manager at Zenith Supply Chain Solutions. I paused, recognizing the name instantly. Zenith was the very first company I had applied to 2 years ago after my parents fired me. Thomas Bradley was the exact hiring manager who had laughed in my face, thrown my resume in the trash, and had security escort me out of his building after receiving my mother's defamatory email. Hello, Thomas, I said, my voice turning dangerously cold. What can I do for you? Rachel. I was just reading the Forbes feature this morning. Thomas stammered, his tone dripping with desperate, obsequious flattery. I was absolutely blown away by your strategic acquisition of the Apex infrastructure. We are currently looking for a senior vice president of operations here at Zenith. We are prepared to offer a highly competitive compensation package. 7 figures, full benefits, massive signing bonus. We would love to bring a visionary like you onto our executive board. He was sweating. I could hear it in his voice. He realized he had burned a bridge with a woman who was now completely out of his league, and he was desperately trying to salvage his own terrible judgment. I looked down at the Forbes magazine resting on my mahogany desk. I looked at the glossy photo of myself. I thought about the days I spent eating canned food, terrified of being evicted, all because men like Thomas Bradley refused to do a basic background check. I am highly flattered by the generous offer, Thomas, I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite but utterly lethal. Oh, excellent. He breathed, a heavy sigh of relief echoing through the receiver. When can we schedule a sit-down to discuss the terms? You misunderstand me, Thomas, I stated, firmly cutting off his pathetic excitement. I said I was flattered. I did not say I was interested. When I walked into your office 2 years ago, you called me a criminal. You did not ask for my side of the story. You did not run an independent audit. You took the word of a corrupt regime because it was convenient for you. Rachel, please, I had no idea, Thomas pleaded, his voice shrinking into a pathetic whine. The email came directly from the CEO of Apex. I was just following standard industry protocol. Standard industry protocol requires due diligence, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh final whisper. Sorry, Thomas. I do not work for people who do not verify their facts. I did not wait for his sputtering apologies. I placed the phone receiver firmly back onto its cradle, cutting the connection entirely. I turned away from the desk and walked back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. I picked up my ceramic mug and took a long, slow sip of my hot black coffee. I looked out over the glittering metallic skyline of the city. The sky was perfectly clear. The winter sun shone brightly, reflecting off the endless expanse of glass and steel. My parents were locked in federal holding cells. My sister had lost her fake crown. My career was entirely bulletproof. It was a complete, absolute, untouchable victory. Rachel's journey reveals a profound lesson. True power against toxic family members lies in quiet preparation and absolute independence, not in begging for their validation. When her parents destroyed her career, she didn't waste energy screaming at their lies. Instead, Rachel meticulously built her own empire and secured ironclad legal boundaries. She proved that sharing DNA does not entitle anyone to abuse you. Real vindication happens when you stop seeking their approval and let your undeniable success dismantle their illusions. Take control of your own narrative today and build a foundation they cannot touch. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to rebuild your life? Please share your story in the comments below.